Fate. Souls and Singularities Chapter 118 to 120. 118. Guda Guda Hanaji. Ending Guda Guda Hanaji. Ending. Archon staggered backwards as another explosion washed over his body. The Silver Knight swung his shield to the side and dissipated the cloud of smoke that hovered in the air just in front of his person. Growling, the knight charged through the cloud and drew back his right hand. Golden lightning crackled between his fingertips as the power of the miracle flooded through his body. Eyes locked onto the multicolored form of Kuroda still dancing around the street a short ways from them, still hurling exploding metal beetles towards both Archon and Sakura Saber by his side. Tensing his body, Archon swung his right arm forwards and hurled the solidified miracle like a javelin towards the man. Kuroda ducked down, just barely avoiding being struck by it before his mocking laugh echoed through the roads. The man got back up from the ground and rolled away from them like a stone down a hill before he slipped onto his side and posed. Archon felt his already frustrated temperament get increasingly more stoked with rage. His hand fell onto his sword grip and ripped it free of its scabbard with a screeching of steel. He then hunched his body down and rocketed as fast as he could down the street. His lumbering, heavily armored form made for quite the intimidating sight, although it was still nothing compared to Sakura Saber's blur of pale pink as she zipped across the street towards Kuroda. Despite the two Saber servants charging him down, Kuroda instead continued to grin like a lunatic before he spread his arms wide, hurling forth another dozen explosives down the street towards the group. Hee 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 ha 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 ha. The man continued to laugh as the detonations ripped through the town, concealing him in a cloud of smoke and working to block the sight of the two sabers. TCH, Archon loudly clicked his tongue in annoyance as he scanned the cloud, head occasionally darting in the direction of a noise as he tensed himself for combat. As the smoke started to clear, he could vaguely make out the shape of a figure standing in the middle of the street looking in his general direction. He then rolled to the side as an arctic blizzard seemingly erupted from it towards him. A thin layer of ice washed over the ground as the smoke dissipated, revealing a woman in white with an appearance that looked as though it had been torn straight from a book, simple white robes and a similar colored tiara. There was no change in shading, merely a singular block color with black lines to highlight different features. Archon furrowed his brows behind his helmet as the figure slowly faded from existence. Behind her stood what looked like a child with bright blue hair and noble clothes. A simple sky blue tunic with a light blue bow tie, a white undershirt with black stripes running down the sleeves and navy-colored shorts ending in high socks that went past his knees and simple brown-laced shoes. The Silver Knight was almost left convinced that a child had wandered onto the streets before the boy opened his mouth and a slightly irritated sigh left his lips, sounding much deeper than a person with his presumed age had any right to. Unless they were simply a dwarf with a gift of youth, that was also possible. Honestly, the boy shook his head as he flipped open the leather-bound book in his hands and skimmed through the pages. A sudden appearance by another figure? This town is already lacking in distinction and they believe it can be improved by merely throwing in a few characters of mild interest? That is poor world building if ever I've seen it. Another sigh escaped his throat as he looked up from his book and towards Archon. I suppose there is little that either one of us can do about it though, is there? Archon had no idea how to respond, save to raise himself up and level his sword at the young man. I shall presume you are an enemy of mine? I suppose. The boy admitted without a care in the world, shrugging his shoulders and looking thoroughly done with the situation he was in. I was summoned here and conjoined with someone's true name for whatever reason. Perhaps there is some part of my personality that the two of us had in common. He made a face. How awful to consider. If there is one thing I can't stand, it's plagiarism. I lost sight of Kuroda, Sakura Saber announced as she slid to a halt next to Archon, then laid eyes upon the child and blinked once. How is your prime physical age that of a child? They say children have the best imaginations. The blue-haired man responded uncaringly, looking between the two of them for a few moments him. Then looked past them and furrowed his brows as if searching for something. Is it just you two here? Are there no characters of complexity in the area? Archon blinked behind his helmet. I beg your pardon? I did not stutter, did I? The boy sighed before shaking his head. No, I suppose I shouldn't complain too much. In this current setting, it's hardly like I can expect anything truly interesting to show up. There was a pause before they pointed to themselves. I guess I should introduce myself then. I'm Takenaka Anderson. He gave a lazy wave of the hand to accompany the movement before the limb fell back to his side. The Silver Knight stared at him in silence before he looked at Sakura Saber. The woman gave a faint shrug of the shoulders before the pair looked back towards the blue-haired boy. As the knight went to speak, a flash of sunlight reflected off a surface caught his line of sight. Spinning on his heel, he swung his shield out to the side and struck the flying beetle away from him and soared high into the air before it exploded. Archon's eyes locked onto the form of Kuroda instantly before he thrust his sword towards him. "Handle the fool, I shall deal with the child." Sakura Saber gave a hum of acknowledgement before she took off, kicking off the ground and launching herself through the air like an arrow aimed at the jester. Archon turned his attention back onto Takenaka just in time to raise his shield once again as a veritable storm struck him. High-powered winds crashed against his body and caused his feet to scrape against the cobblestone as he tried to maintain his balance. The winds died down to unveil the image of a woman with the lower half of a fish sitting atop a rock with her hand stretched out towards him. Her body is already fading away into motes of light. "What manner of Izalith spawn do you conjure up from nothing?" Archon couldn't help but ask in a sense of disturbed curiosity.
"Trust me, it's more appealing when you've read the stories." There was a pause before he sighed, "And I'm now shilling my own work. I can't decide if that's good or just plain pathetic." Digging into his pocket, he withdrew a small match and flicked his thumb along the top of it, igniting the stick. "Whatever," he grunted as he hurled it forwards. The second it touched the ground, Archon felt heat suddenly build up underneath him. The knight jumped back as a pillar of fire burst from the ground where he had been standing. As he did so, a small white dove struck him on the side of the head, its body surrounded by an ethereal ocean-colored glow. The knight stumbled once in surprise as the bird flew around and made to return only to run head first into Archon's shield. The knight parried the bird away and sent it into the ground with a grunt of annoyance before he whirled on Takenaka and sheathed his sword. Drawing his arm back, he formed another sunlight spear and hurled it forwards. A wall of branches formed in front of the young man, tanking the blow and shattering several of the main roots but otherwise doing its role as a wall. Archon kicked off the ground, breaking into a sprint and raising his shield in the direction of the boy, already preparing himself for more attacks. Takenaka gave an annoyed sigh over the sound of Archon's boots crashing into the ground. "And this is why I don't like to work alone. I'm not a combat-type servant." Whether Archon actually heard him or not didn't factor into his actions. Instead, he smashed straight through the wall made of wood and charged down the caster, only to slip on a patch of conveniently placed ice, courtesy of a certain snow summon, and fall onto his backside. His embarrassment didn't stop there. The ice led off into a small path which ended up taking Archon on a small trip where he was then clothes-lined by a branch and sent onto his back, staring up at the sky.
"Doesn't mean I'm absolutely terrible though," Takenaka seemed to add on as an afterthought. A small glowing sprite leapt from his book and bounced twice along the ground before landing atop Archon's head and exploding in a small flash of orange flames. Archon hissed in annoyance from his downed position, shifting his body and getting onto his hands and knees before his head snapped up in the direction of the blue-haired boy. "That being said, it's actually not me you're fighting." He nodded to something just behind the knight. Indeed, a shadow fell over him which had Archon pause and stare at it for a moment before shifting his attention and looking up at the figure blocking out the sun. If his head had been exposed, then everyone would have been able to see the exact moment when the blood left his face and he turned a shade of white that would have made Snow envious. "Yes," the figure atop their rather intimidating mount proclaimed. A dark-haired girl wearing a plain white dress beamed as she pointed to the sky. "It is I Philiozan." Takenaka made a noise of understanding behind Archon. "Trust me, it's not something I'm capable of understanding either. And this is the mount I have borrowed from my older brother, Nagao Ferritora," she exclaimed, her face still awash with giddish pride even as Archon scrambled away from them making a strangled noise on the verge of a panicked scream. "Howl. How sho Yamikurai." Archon was already halfway down the street by the time she had finished speaking. Kuroda Mephisto released a faint grunt as his back slammed into a nearby wall. The man had barely a moment to recover before a flash of steel flew in from the corner of his eye. The man tried to duck beneath the strike and proved much too slow. A pained hiss left his mouth as steel bit into flesh near his shoulder and sent him to ground. Rolling away, he managed a weak chuckle in between gasps of pain as he made to get back onto his legs. Swinging his arm to the side, he manifested an oversized pair of scissors in his left hand and swung them upwards at Sakura Saber. The woman raised her sword, catching the blow without even moving as she stared down at him with a glassy-eyed expression.
Kuroda released another cackle as he tried to jump back only for her to fall upon him again with another flash of light and the sound of steel slicing through fabric and flesh. Blood splashed on the ground as Kuroda fell back with a deep cut through his abdomen.
Hee ha ha ha, ow. The man groaned in between laughs as he writhed on the ground, raising his right hand and pointing at her. And now that's certainly one way of cutting to the heart of the matter. Ha ha ha, pressing his hand against the cut he dragged himself back and sighed. Is this why I get such little representation? He wondered aloud with a ponderous look on his face. Because the moment I encounter a servant that can fight, I get bested? I don't know what you're talking about. Sakura Saber dryly responded as she tensed her body and prepared her sword a second time, this time aiming to finish the man off in a single strike. All I am aware of is that you stand in our way. Well, Kuroda managed a weak chuckle as blood slipped from between his lips and down his chin, giving her a knowing look. Not just me.
Sakura Saber furrowed her brows before her expression thinned, catching his true meaning. Other servants are here, it is to be expected. She nodded her head before giving him a narrowed gaze. However, they shall fall in much the same way that you. Retreat. Archon's voice boomed out across the street. Both Sakura Saber and Kuroda looked in the direction of the shout just in time to see Archon come barreling out of an alley and crash into a vegetable stall. The noblites that were manning the stall seemed to complain only for them to release startled shrieks of their own and take off in the opposite direction.
At first, Sakura Saber believed Archon had managed to intimidate them, only to blink as she watched him pick up the cart next to the stall and hurl the entire wagon of vegetables down the alleyway he had come rushing out from, then turn on his heel in her direction and break into a sprint without ever making an effort to turn around. Retreat, he cried out again, waving his arms towards her and his voice taking on a noticeable degree of panic. Then a large shadow came bursting from out of the alley, sending a mess of debris flying into the air and coming down as a show of wood, plaster and brick. Galloped forth Hosho Yamikurai, the young girl, looking around the age of 11, cried out at the top of her lungs and pointed at them, for the glory of Big Brother Nagao Fairtora. Let us recount our battle cry, AA. The dragon she rode upon threw back its head and spread all four of its wings, unleashing a tremendous roar. Sakura Saber gave a single blink. Suddenly Archon's panic made much more sense to her. Ritsuka slid to a halt and furrowed his brows as he stared ahead of himself towards the empty street. Mash came to a halt at his side and stared ahead as well. Did I just hear something? I heard it too, Senpai. Did it sound like a roar to you? It did, Senpai. Should I be concerned? I'll be right here, Senpai. Mash nodded to herself, bringing forth her shield and slamming it into the ground. I shall protect you with all of my being. The master gave a half smile. Thanks, Mash. His expression steeled again before bringing up his communicator and activating it. Okay, so we heard a big roar a second ago, Roman. I'm going to need a run, you idiot. Olga's voice instead came bursting through the communicator with enough volume that the audio actually crackled for a few moments, prompting the master to wince and lean away from it. You've got a high-class life form heading right for you accompanied by a divine spirit. Ritsuka blinked. So we've got a god and a big animal rushing towards us? He frowned and looked at Mash. You think Farum caught up with us after beating Takeda Darius? Mash thinned her lips and shrugged. It is possible, Senpai. I do not know the capabilities of Darius, but I believe that Farum-san is the better warrior considering their position as a god of war and what we know of the battle in France. Well, we've beat him before, sort of. He winced. Actually, we didn't beat him at all. He realized with a frown before shaking his head. Alright, so we need to run away before we. This isn't him, Olga remarked quickly with her voice still tinged with panic. The readings are more in line with an actual dragon as opposed to what the war god you encountered rode upon. Ritsuka paled slightly. Oh damn. Both he and Mash slowly shifted their attention away from the communicator and towards the street as the sound of crashing got louder. They watched as a cart come rolling around the corner, soon followed by a swarm of noblites scrambling over each other and screaming as loudly as they could in clear terror. That was then followed by Sakura Saber sprinting around the corner and making a sharp turn that almost had her slip over, the girl teetering on her feet for a few moments before taking off again, rushing towards the pair with wide eyes and looking over her shoulder. She was then followed by Archon, who charged through an actual building with all the grace of someone who had just charged through a building. That is to say, no grace at all. Despite that, the knight perfectly exemplified the aura of someone who was fleeing for his life.
arms swinging from side to side like pendulums and his legs digging into the stone path with each step and pushing his body forwards with enough force to crack rock.
"Run away!" Sakura Saber all but blurted out as she got within shouting distance of them, "D-Dragon." Ritsuka couldn't help but groan, "That's just type." A giant dark-scaled dragon erupted from the side of a building, scrambling around on its four legs and whirling around to face them as if it hadn't just decimated a neighborhood. From nose to tail, Ritsuka was certain it was a fair bit smaller than Fafnir, probably no more than 20 meters long, although that didn't change the fact it was a dragon and still a danger. The arrow-shaped head locked onto them from a distance. The dragon then rose up on its hind legs and spread its four wings as wide as it could and unleashed a roar which would have shattered glass. On its back, as if to contradict its threatening visage, was a young girl 5 years Ritsuka's junior, sporting tied-up dark gray hair and a silver tiara, wearing a simple royal white dress. She pointed towards them, her voice echoing out amongst the town. "There's more of them, Hosho Yamikurai." She was grinning like a child spotting candy. "Onwards." "Oh shit!" Ritsuka blurted out, scrambling backwards and turning on his heel, rushing back towards the direction they had come and being swiftly followed by Mash, Sakura Saber, Archon and an entire dragon. Ash held up his hand to signal the pair to halt, his brows furrowed slightly as he gazed amongst the streets. "I hear a commotion." Demon Archer released a snort by his side. "I think the entire town heard that commotion. Someone is getting maimed out there." "Quite so," Ash nodded his head, despite that the roar sounded familiar. He had heard it before, although placing it was something that was eluding him right now, as if it was somehow lighter than before or what he was used to was at a much deeper tone of voice. He dismissed the notion with a shake of the head. "It was better to find Ritsuka first. Perhaps you should climb atop my shoulders to gain a better vantage point," he advised without looking down at Demon Archer. The woman scoffed once. "I'll be fine." Ash narrowed his eyes ever so slightly, glancing at her from the corner of his vision. There was something odd about her these last few streets. He'd lost sight of her, then she came marching from the crowd as if she hadn't vanished on him. Then there were a few of the tics he had noticed that hadn't lined up with what he knew of her thus far. For starters, she didn't want to ride on his shoulders. That was just flat out odd to him. Thus far she hadn't so much as entertained the notion of climbing down from her vantage point since she had gotten up there. Either she believed that the advantage gifted by riding atop his shoulders was no longer necessary or there was something else at play here. Either way, it was worth keeping an eye on for the time being, at least until there came a point where he could ask her about it. Right now, he suspected there were other concerns that he had to deal with. Straining his ears, Ash moved forwards until he came upon the side entrance onto the main path. Then blinked as he watched Mash go sprinting past him as fast as she could with Ritsuka in her arms princess style. The boy's face an absolute ridicule of terror as he gazed over the pair's shoulders. They were swiftly followed by Sakura Saber running forwards without making an effort to look behind her. Then Archon came lumbering down the street, punching his armored boots through the cobblestone road with each step. The entire group rushed past him without so much as paying attention to their surroundings, failing to even register his existence as they were seemingly determined in getting away from whatever it was that they were running away from. Frowning ever so slightly, Ash hesitantly walked out of the alley and into the main road before he turned his head in the direction that the others had so desperately been attempting to run away from. "Well," Demon Archer bluntly asked as she walked out into the road behind him, "what are they all running and scream MMAHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHer voice swiftly rose into a panicked shriek as Ash spun around her waist and tucked her under his armpit and broke into a sprint after the fleeing group. The Sarcher pushed his body to his limits, swiftly catching up with the fleeing Chaldeans and sprinting right past Archon, the man's head looking in his direction once, then twice as he realized he was getting bypassed before he looked over his shoulder a final time. Midir was still very much chasing after them. The Archdragon released another bellowing roar which traveled down the length of the road and overtook them with ease, providing the Chaldeans with even more fuel to hasten their attempt at a rapid escape. All the while, the young girl riding on the dragon's back continued to let out an enthused giggle as if she was on a roller coaster. It would have been somewhat heartwarming if it were not for the fact that she was currently sitting atop the rather large phantasmal beast that was determined to turn the Chaldeans into a rather ashen memory. "I can run by myself," Demon Archer cried out from under his arm, then paused when she heard another roar being delivered by Midir but didn't make an effort to look behind herself. "On second thought, keep running. A beat, in fact."
Speed up. Ash didn't need much encouragement from her in that regard. Fighting the dragon Midir again was not something he was particularly looking forward to. Even if they did look considerably smaller than he remembered them being. However, the fact remained that he couldn't actually fight with her under his arm like this. I'm going to throw you ahead. If you do not stick the landing, there is a high chance we will run you down. He spoke in a curt tone as he continued to move forwards. His voice was so casual that the girl in his arms didn't think to examine the words closer.
For all of 5 seconds. Then her eyes nearly bulged in their sockets. Wait, wah.
Ash released a grunt as he hurled her with all his might, throwing her forwards like a javelin as she let out a high-pitched scream of surprise, soaring over the heads of all those in front of the pair and even earning their baffled attention for a few seconds.
Demon Archer scowled in the Sarcher's direction before he orientated herself in the air and crashed into the ground head first, twisting her body and forcing herself into a roll before she soon returned to her feet and continued on as if nothing had happened, falling into step just behind Sakura Saber and the Ritsuka Mash duo, who were somehow still at the head of the pack. Ash turned around, sprinting backwards as he drew forth his large bow and knocked an arrow in it, looking up towards Midir and drawing the string back until the bow itself started creak in protest. Archon, who was still running behind him, widened his eyes behind his helmet the second he caught the Sarcher taking aim with their bow in his direction. The Silver Knight bit back a curse and swerved his body to the side just as the Sarcher aimed his shot to fly towards the dragon's head and loosened the arrow. The string snapped back to its original position like the crack of a whip and propelled the arrow forth like a missile. The blow didn't even register to the archdragon. Despite burying itself nearly a foot into the front of his skull, the mount didn't so much as flinch after taking the blow and instead seemingly increased their speed as the girl atop its back pointed at them. Ha 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 ha. She laughed out loud, grinning at them widely. You fools, Hosho Yamikurai is the strongest in the world. He'd never lose to the likes of you. Ash neglected to mention that he had already killed Midir and he killed him when they were probably fully grown as well. Second strongest, Big Brother is actually the strongest. She added on as an addendum. Ash also didn't point out he had killed him too. Archon sped past him as he prepared to knock another arrow. He noticed that Midir was already focusing on him. Whether that was because the dragon knew who he was or was just irritated about being shot in the face, he couldn't actually tell. Either way, he swiftly abandoned his notion of firing while running backwards. Slotting his great bow back onto his back, he then turned around and continued to run forwards as fast as he could. We need to fight somewhere more suitable, Ritsuka informed the group as calmly as he could, that amount of calmness being shouting at the top of his lungs like a madman while staring down at the dragon chasing them. This place is just one straight box. Yes, Senpai, Mash nodded along with his assessment. I'm sure we could wait for the dragon to clear a few houses for us, Demon Archer snapped from behind them as she looked over her shoulder once more before blanching and snapping her head back around to the front. If we're alive that long, anyway. Sakura Saber released a scoff behind them. Aren't you supposed to be more confident? What about your three-line formation? Demon Archer opened her mouth to respond before she blinked and slowly closed it, her eyes gradually getting wider and wider as she realized just how effective her noble phantasm would be against their current opponent. Were they a rider-servant? Well, she was riding a dragon, but it was never easy to tell with these sorts of things anymore. It was like assuming a servant was a saber because they used a sword when they were actually an archer. Classes didn't mean diddly squat if you could just change your weapon after being summoned. Were they divine? They were quite clearly a goddess. They even had the feel for one and everything. Did they have a high mystery? They were a goddess riding a dragon, both from another world. There was probably a fair amount of mystery there. Demon Archer allowed a sharp grin to slowly work itself onto her face as she nodded her head once, on second thought. I can definitely take them. Ritsuka did a double take, looking at the girl with clear surprise. You can? Why do you sound so surprised? The black-haired girl asked with a dumbfounded expression. Did you think I was completely useless or something? The thought had crossed my mind, yeah. Ritsuka admitted with an unabashed shrug of the shoulders. You were the one who said you were a level 1 noob, though, so that's sort of on you as well rather than me. Demon Archer gave him a horrified look. Seriously? What the heck was I doing telling you that? Ritsuka shrugged again. It's your mind. You tell me. He then gazed over his shoulder once more and frowned. So, you can do something about that, you said? Demon King smirked as she slid to a halt and spun around to face the street,
letting the others rush past her and barely catching a glimpse of the blonde Sarcher as she did so. The man stared at her for half a second in confusion before he carried on moving past her. The girl placed her hands on her hips and assumed a posture that just boasted of self-assurance. Not even caring at the dragon currently charging down towards her with its fangs bared. "It can't be helped now," she cried out with a sharp grin, throwing her right hand forwards and extending her fingers. "Show your corpse to the 3,000 worlds." Space around her split open, hundreds of flintlock rifles slowly fizzled into existence, hovering behind her in rows upon rows and all aimed towards the charging dragon.
Demon descent. She flicked her hand to the side. Behold, the Demon King's three-line formation. The flintlock rifles discharged as one. The guns roared at a volume that matched their target as their projectile shells rocketed through the air towards the dragon as it reared back in preparation to leap towards them. The second the bullets struck the beast, they exploded in showers of brilliant golden light, sundering the body with painful explosions and causing to recoil violently away from the demon archer. The goddess on its back let out a surprise cry as the pair of them were thrown away by the attack. Midir fell onto his hind legs and lurched backwards, spreading his wings wide in an effort to catch himself but ultimately failing as they crashed through a two-story building. The paper-thin walls offered no resistance and the wooden supports barely registered as they were shattered into dust from the weight of the dragon. Aya Filiozan was thrown from the dragon's back, roughly landing on the stone path and rolling for a few meters before coming to a halt. Her head gradually raised itself from the path and stared down at the utterly dumbstruck group before she yawned. "I'm tired," she mumbled before slumping onto the floor once again and curling up into a ball, snuggling into herself to try and get some measure of warmth. She remained there for a few moments as Hosho Yamikurai picked themselves out of the ruined building and shook their head to dislodge any stray part of debris that had gotten wedged in their scales. The dragon stared down at his rider's unconscious body before slowly craning their attention towards the Chaldeans. Both sides gazed at their opposite number without making a single sound. Then Hosho Yamikurai made a grumbling noise of exhaustion before leaning down and extending a clawed hand towards the sleeping goddess, scooping her up into his arms and slowly shifting her so that she was then resting on his back. With a final look aimed at the Chaldeans, the dragon gave a single snort before spreading their four wings wide and taking back off into the air as if they hadn't been on the receiving end of an A-rank noble phantasm that was only missing, Dragon Slayer, to be considered one of the deadliest skills they could ever face. Not that they didn't show signs of damage, judging by the way their shrinking figure would occasionally wobble in the sky. Demon Archer turned around, crossing her arms and grinning smugly to herself. "Well, how is that for a level 1 noob? I'm definitely op last boss material." "Oh crap." Ritsuka blinked repeatedly before he smiled and gave the girl a thumbs up. "That was actually pretty damn awesome." Lowering the hand, he exhaled. "Now then. Let's find those other two and then get that Holy Grail, then get the hell out of this place." The blue-haired boy was easily found, still in more or less the last place that they had left him with a book in his hand and perched atop a nearby cart. He looked up towards the approaching group with an utterly flat expression, eyes moving between each of the Chaldeans before he exhaled and snapped his book shut. "I suppose that means you bested the dragon then," he muttered to himself before waving his hand. "Don't bother answering that. You're alive and they aren't here, so they're either dead or you utilized some contrived plot device to send them packing." He paused, turning to face them and narrowing his eyes in suspicion. "You did, didn't you?" Ritsuka opened his mouth to respond before he slowly closed it again and furrowed his brows, trying to work out a method by which he could respond to that particular sentence before offering a faint shrug and a strained smile. "Maybe?" "Typical." Takenaka huffed, crossing his arms and jumping down from the crate and spreading his arms wide. "Well, go on then. Get it over with." Ritsuka raised an eyebrow. "Get what over with?" Before he could even finish his sentence, one of Ash's arrows rocketed past him and punched straight through Takenaka's chest and left behind a fist-sized hole. The force behind the arrow sent the body ragdolling through the air and crashing into the wall of one of the nearby houses and then threw it in a cloud of smoke, the servant vanishing in golden lights as he flew. Ritsuka opened and closed his jaw like a fish before he turned towards Ash with wide eyes. "Seriously?" "What?" Ash frowned before nodding to Archon. He was already an enemy, was he not? He was. Archon admitted with a shrug of the shoulders before nodding his head at the Sarcher, and if he didn't kill him, I would have. Ritsuka closed his eyes, raising his head and aiming it skywards as he slowly exhaled from his nose before he lowered it once again and opened his eyes up. raising a single finger. A little warning, next time. He lowered the finger. Now then, where's the other one? Probably dead. Sakura Saber admitted after a few moments. I did strike him with a fatal blow across the chest. Unless he has some manner of battle continuation, he probably won't have lived that long. So we just need to find the Holy Grail now? Ritsuka sighed to himself. Because that isn't going to be hard at. Found it, Senpai, Mash excitedly called out from a distance away as she held it up, the girl standing up from behind a vegetable stall. It was in the pile of cabbages. Ritsuka closed his eyes. As I was saying, it wasn't hard at all. Sakura Saber gave him a pitying smile as he attempted to save himself from embarrassment, failing miserably as all those who were in earshot of him could tell. Archon merely sighed and rested his hand on the front of his helmet once again. Demon Archer slowly started to walk towards Mash, her smile becoming the tiniest bit sharper as she did so. "What?" A voice rang out across the town before the archer even got to within a few feet of the shielder. Her eyes widened and snapped towards the direction of the voice. The attention of the Chaldeans followed her as they all found themselves transfixed by the sight of a second demon archer barreling towards them, screaming at the top of her lungs. The second demon archer slid to a halt and stabbed a finger towards the demon archer who had been residing with the Chaldeans. "I've been tied up behind a dumpster for the last few minutes," she cried out. "She knocked me out and took my place. She's an imposter." "That's nonsense." The first demon archer scoffed loudly. "Clearly she's another part of my subconscious that has." A fist cracked against the side of her head and she dropped like a sack of potatoes, her unconscious body hitting the floor with a dull thud. The speed at which the attack had happened managed to earn a surprised blink from everyone, including the second demon archer, who widened her eyes and allowed her pointing arm to fall limply down to her side. Ash retracted his feet and stared down at the unconscious servant with a faint frown before nodding to himself once. There was something off about her, but I did not imagine it to be an imposter. Ritsuka made several noises before he just pointed at Ash. Did you seriously just take her word like that?" he asked with disbelief. "How do you know that one isn't the imposter instead and you just punched out one of our allies?" "I concur with my lord." Archon stepped up, nodding his head once. "We should punch them both in the face just to be safe." "Ye know," Ritsuka snapped at the man, reaching up and nursing his brows. "There's supposed to be an order to this sort of thing. So some kind of procedure." He lowered his arm and sighed. "What evidence does she have that she's not the fake?" Ash blinked once, then turned to the still conscious demon archer. "Slingshot gun?" She grinned back at him. "Why not make it full auto?" "She's real." Ash nodded once and turned back to face Ritsuka with a confident look on his face, even as the master just stared at him dubiously. Just like that, even Sakura Saber couldn't help but ask with disbelief, "How do you not know that the imposter doesn't share memories with the original?" Ash blinked once more before he pointed at the unconscious servant on the floor. "She gave herself away. She acted somewhat dissimilar to the demon archer we had been traveling with up until this point." Mash tilted her head in surprise. "You picked up on those subtle tells, Ash-san?" She stared at him for a few moments more before her expression became odd. "That's amazing. Just like Sherlock Holmes." Ritsuka raised a single finger in the shielder's direction, already bracing himself for Ash's line of reasoning. "Before you start celebrating," he sighed and looked at Ash, "what sort of clues did she give you?" "She didn't want to ride on my shoulders." "Oh, is that all?" Ritsuka sighed, then raised a thumbs up. "Yes, good work, Columbo." He turned towards Mash and winced at her expression. The previous look of awe had all but evaporated into dust, replaced instead by the same look of dull disappointment that he had seen her aim at Roman whenever he did something somewhat stupid and or airheaded. The difference between the doctor and Ash was that the latter didn't even register the emotional damage the attack unleashed. He weathered the shielder's expression without so much as a twitch as he then looked between the others and scanned their expressions similarly. Even Demon Archer looked somewhat flabbergasted by the reasoning before she shrugged her shoulders once. "Meh," she grunted, "reminds me of Nagayoshi." Ritsuka raised his hands up to his face and buried it in his palms, exhaling into them. He heard a dull thud of what sounded like something striking meat, then whipped his head back up to see Archon slowly withdrawing his arm away from the downed Demon Archer. Ritsuka stared at him with a mystified expression. Archon stared right back. She was getting back up. He motioned to the first demon archer. "I give up." Ritsuka shrugged, then went to his communicator. "Da Vinci, we've got the Grail, can we leave this place?" Yeah. Davinic's voice came back through. Actually, this location started to collapse the second you retrieved the Grail. We already started the reshift process on this end of things, so you should be back within a few seconds. There was a pause before she chuckled. In other news, I managed to get a lot of interesting pots. Wonderful. Wahahahaha. Demon Archer threw her head back and laughed, walking towards Ritska and slapping him once on the back with enough force to stumble him ever so slightly. It can't be helped. This is one way to unify a country, We didn't unify anything. Ritska pointed out with a baffled expression. We just walked around and picked fights with everyone until we were the only ones left.
Well, yeah. Demon Archer gave him an odd look, lowering her hand back to her side and tilting her head in a confused manner. Why? What do you normally do when it comes to unification? There was a brief pause before she hummed, and if you're the only one left at the end, hasn't the land technically been unified? There's no longer opposition to you and all the territories remain the same just without the people to govern them. Ritska blinked repeatedly at her before he sighed. I've got nothing for that. It sounds so very wrong and yet it makes a lot of sense. He shrugged. Maybe I'm just tired and I want to get back to Chaldea, so I'm not putting in all of my brain power into understanding that sentence. He turned to Archon. Well. No, you are correct. Archon nodded along. It sounds incredibly wrong and borders on madness. The man paused before gritting his teeth. However, her words are true in spirit alone. If you are all that remains, then there is no longer opposition and the land has technically been unified. He turned towards Ritska. I feel the need to also point out that simply slaughtering the entire populace is not a method of unification.
I wasn't talking about that. Demon Archer exclaimed with a shake of the head. I just meant beating them until all the leaders are gone or convinced of your strength. She placed her hands on her hips and raised an eyebrow. Is that seriously weird? Then why did you phrase it in such a dubious fashion? I phrased it perfectly fine. She pointed at him. You're the one who was talking about slaughtering people, not me.
Mount Hiei. Sakura Saber coughed under her breath, earning a sharp-eyed glare from Demon Archer for a brief moment. Those monks were asking for it. Ash blinked once. Monks. Don't worry about it. Ash then shrugged and looked away, easily accepting the argument before he looked down at the first Demon Archer. What do with this?
A gunshot rang through the air. The group jolted at Demon Archer suddenly pulling out a rifle and shooting her doppelganger through the head. For the love of... Ritska exclaimed as he jumped back and clenched his hands into fists. Some warning would be nice once in a while. He shouted out and pointed at the gradually vanishing body. What the heck was that supposed to be? She's an enemy. Demon Archer shrugged her shoulders and dissipated the rifle in her hands. What's the issue?
I am inclined to agree. What is the issue? Don't you start. Ritska pointed at Archon. You're just saying that because you got to watch her die. That is indeed a large factor in my answer, yes. Archon nodded without hiding the fact, but she was still an enemy, and with her dead, the last solid remnant of this singularity should be fading away into nothing when we depart, especially with the Holy Grail in our possession. He paused before he released a breath that he sounded as though he had been holding in for centuries. I, for one, could not be more pleased.
Yes. Well, Demon Archer grinned and moved towards Ash before climbing back atop his shoulders without a word of protest from the Sarcher. Let us get back to Chaldea.
Mash blinked once. Us. Yes. Demon Archer raised an eyebrow. I'm coming with you. Not alone you aren't. Sakura Saber pointed at her before she paused and turned to Ritska. With your permission. I'm fine with you coming back. Ritska waved his hand and gave her a faint smile. Thanks for all your help, by the way. The girl beamed. Yes, I knew it. She pumped her fist once. Okita-san's great victory.
Ritska blinked repeatedly. Okita? He parroted the name back with a raised eyebrow, as in, Okita Soji?
Ah, why yes. She nodded once. I should introduce myself properly. I am Okita Soji. ... And another one goes on the whiteboard. Huh. Nothing. Wahahaha. Demon Archer laughed loudly. If you believe the manslayer is impressive enough, then you have yet to be amazed by my true identity. Indeed, I am the first great unifier of Japan, the one who would bring an end to the age of the warring states, the one who was called the Fool of Awari. I am
Oda Nobunaga. Oda Nobu Eh? The girl stilled and looked down at Ritska with wide eyes, watching as he smirked up at her. You, what Eh? Huh. Ritska chuckled and nodded towards Mash. What do you know? This trip had some silver lining after all.
How, Eh? Demon King of the Sixth Heaven is pretty distinctive. Ritsuka pointed out, crossing his arms in front of his chest. You should probably avoid doing that in future.
Nobunaga stared at him with a dumbstruck look as her arms fell back to her sides. But my introduction? Many of those titles did not mean much to me anyway. Ash admitted with a shrug of his shoulders, slightly jostling the Demon King, resting atop them. Therefore, it would have mattered little to me beyond learning what your name was. It's the principle of the matter. The group was gradually consumed in a flash of light as they returned to Chaldea, along with the newest arrivals. Guda Guda Hanaji. N. And like that, we're done with events.
Yep, the events between Singularities 3 and 4 are done, which means the next chapter is back into the main swing of things.
It won't be Singularity 4 though, it's going to be Singularity 3.5. Which I shall announce the title of right now, next time.
Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Chapter 118, A Land of Ice and Fog. In the beginning, the world was unformed.
Our race came into existence before the beginning. We knew nothing but existence, light, dark, life, death, heat, cold, time. These did not exist for us, nor did they exist for the world. A land free of disparity. Our home. Then they came from the depths and brought with them being. Our minds were flooded with knowledge, with purpose, with fear and with love. We existed for time uncountable before the flame. Ours was a simple existence. The flame brought us, for the first time ever, life to our beings. It brought an end to our world and branded the land with disparity. That which brought us life would bring with it death. Where we found bonds of love between our race, we also found envy and hatred birthed in others. It marked not just the beginning of our existence, but also its end. The doors to the command room started to open, the group poured into the room soon after. When Ritsuka, Mash and Ash arrived they found that the room was already occupied by Olga, Da Vinci and Romani. The trio who were present shifted their attention to look in the direction of the Rayshift team with Romani offering them a smile and a wave of the hand.
Morning. Ritsuka greeted as he walked in, offering a wave back at them before he lowered the limb back to his side and thinned his lips, turning to the director and speaking again. I take it this means we've located the next singularity.
Quite so. Olga nodded her head curtly, turning to face the trio and walking towards them. The next singularity we have located has been detected to be in London. Her lips thinned and she looked away for a moment as if considering something. London during the 19th century. Specifically 1888.
Mash frowned at the words ever so slightly as she tilted her head. That is, rather recent, is it not? Not more recent than Singularity F but still considerably more troubling in scope. The director explained as she turned to Ritsuka. You recall what we have spoken of during your impromptu education.
Ritsuka gave a nod of affirmation. London is the home of the clock tower, which is one of the three main pillars of the Mages Association. He looked towards Romani and Da Vinci, raising a single eyebrow. Is this basically like saying someone attacked the clock tower?
In effect, yes. Romani nodded his head moving to point at the monitors in front of him. It also means that whatever they're doing, it spilled out into London itself. While the Mages Association keeps events on the down low for the most part, they wouldn't be able to ignore something like this, which means that this situation is very messy. The other singularities were less troubling to consider as they came at a point in time that wasn't considered the heart of magecraft study. There was a pause from the director, or rather, the local magi weren't nearly as skilled or well organized, and even if they were, they would still be dealing with conditions and opponents they couldn't hope to compare against. She raised her thumb and bit into it. This is completely different, it's the clock tower. Ritsuka hummed, crossing his arms over his chest. So, expect it to be difficult. Expect it to be more wide-reaching. Olga corrected, turning back to face him with a stern frown. The power of the clock tower is not to be underestimated, and for something to attack London during this period in time and cause a disruption large enough to affect all of human history means that they would have inevitably encountered the clock tower, and, given the fact the singularity is still operational, it means they are likely winning against them. The master opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again as if considering something before shaking his head and asking anyway, is that really a surprise? He asked in a curious tone of voice, prompting a raised eyebrow from the director. You said that humans can't compare to servants, right? So, doesn't it make sense they would be able to beat them?
She stared at him for a few moments before slowly nodding her head. Under ordinary circumstances I would agree with you. However, some of the Clocktower lords have been around for hundreds of years, not least of all the director of the Clocktower himself. Romani nodded behind her, crossing his arms and humming to himself. Brishian is the lord of the Department of Lore. The man explained to Ritska with a troubled frown of his own. More than that, he was a student of King Solomon himself when it came to magecraft.
Ritska blinked once. He's certainly a cut above most other lords.
Don't speak so lowly of him. Olga snapped at him before she turned back to Ritska. Lord Brishisan has been alive since the end of King Solomon's reign and is one of the founding members of the Mages Association itself. In terms of ability, he very easily dwarfs even the vice director when it comes to power. While he certainly wouldn't be on the same ranking of the more powerful servants that exist, that does not make him weak by any stretch of the imagination. He is likely one of the few beings who could match a caster-class servant in combat potential. Sorry, I get all that, but, Ritska swallowed, wouldn't he be like, 3,000 years old?
Yes. Oh. He blinked once, then shook his head to consider something. Wait, if he was an apprentice of Solomon, and Solomon is our enemy.
I will overlook you accusing the director of the Clocktower of being a traitor due to your ignorance of the situation. Olga growled at him disapprovingly, placing her hands on her hips and narrowing her eyes. The fact of the matter is that too much work has been placed into the Clocktower for any of the mages involved to turn their backs upon it. Besides, even if King Solomon himself appeared before him and explained that he was going to incinerate humanity, I doubt that Lord Brishisan would give him the time of day. Mash decided to speak up on that point. What if it's a similar situation to Professor Lev?
Olga flinched at the mention of the name while Romani cringed ever so slightly.
Demonic possession. Da Vinci blinked, then cupped her chin. Possible, but we aren't sure how it works either. Whether Lev was always a demon or whether Solomon did something to him at a later date is just speculation at this point. She placed her hands on her hips. For the time being, we can assume that the director of the Clocktower is. She trailed off and clenched her jaw. While not necessarily an ally, they are probably not allied with Solomon. All of which is a moot point. Ash cut into the conversation with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The saber crossed his arms and turned back to the director. For now, we are only aware that someone has attacked this sorcerer den that currently is run by a mage of incredible power, yes? Olga composed herself and nodded her head at Ash. Yes. I would be similarly concerned if someone were to attack the dragon schools of Vinheim and succeed. The saber continued on, cupping his chin and looking away for a moment before turning to Romani. What manner of information do we have on the singularity itself? Romani sighed, slumping down into his chair. Ash understood the reaction. Nothing.
Seriously. Ritska couldn't help but groan, reaching up and rubbing his forehead in exasperation. Again. Don't look so surprised. Olga turned to him, and while she didn't look pleased by the lack of information either, she was able to begrudgingly admit that any force that could pull off a successful attack on the Clocktower had to be one of decent magical knowledge. This is far from being an ordinary attack. However, we should be given a better understanding once you rayshift down. Ritska paused, lowering his hand. So, it's not interference like in Rome. Not quite. Da Vinci explained this time. Think of it like a one-way mirror. She explained, we can't look in, but when you get down there, you'll be able to look out. So to speak. She smiled confidently at them. The good news is that we should be able to maintain contact with you the second you get in. However, all we can really work off is maps of London during the time period to decide where to send you down. We can't get readings of the current climate or anything. The master frowned ever so slightly for a moment as he thought about it. So, not as blind as we were in Rome, but still not great? He asked as he looked around. Well, could be worse, I suppose. Olga merely hummed at him. I would thoroughly recommend bringing the recent caster edition with you. Medea. Yes. Olga nodded once. As a magus, she is top tier and will be able to provide you with information that even we might not be capable of doing. Beyond that, she might be able to better understand the manner of interference. I would recommend bringing Oda Nobunaga. Ash spoke up from the side, earning dull looks from those around him. Her noble phantasm has a high efficiency against those with. He turned to Olga. What did you call it? Mystery.
The director rolled her eyes at him. Yes. Her noble phantasm seems to excel at dealing with those with high divinity. Writing in MYS. She cut off, her face going slack as she looked at Ash in surprise for a few moments. Actually, yes. Take Nobunaga with you as well. Huh? It was Ritsuka's turn to look surprised. How come?
From what we have established, it is growing increasingly likely that servants from an alternate world will be present in each singularity. She explained, that is already giving them a high amount of mystic weight to their existence. Add onto this that their age of gods never ended, then that is heightened further. She turned to Ash and raised an eyebrow. How did you discover this?
Nobunaga explained her noble phantasm to me after I asked why her double was able to floor an archdragon. He explained easily then frowned. Although much of her explanation did not make sense to me. Why does a lack of information matter when attacking something? He asked innocently with a raised eyebrow. Olga groaned to herself and pinched the bridge of her nose. Not that sort of mystery, doled. Ah, is this some other concept I am unused to? Da Vinci chuckled at the saber. You know you have a skill called Mystic Slayer. That basically means you're skilled at killing magical beings?
Yes, I see. Olga merely grunted at the saber's sudden epiphany as she returned her attention to Ritsuka. The moment you head down into London, we'll be in constant communication with you. Be on the alert for any signs of trouble and prepare yourself for combat with whomever might be attacking the clock tower. There was a pause. Search out for any allies who you might be able to find, but be aware that in such a desperate situation, they might be more than willing to take advantage of the situation. Therefore always make sure to keep at least one servant with you whenever you are speaking with them. Are they really that bad? Ritsuka couldn't help but ask. The master gave the director an odd look. Wouldn't it make more sense to prioritize living? One would think so, and most magi will be more than willing to accept a temporary alliance in the face of such a situation. She then frowned. However, there are always those who are more than willing to jeopardize safety if it means discovering a new mystery. She walked up to him and stabbed a finger at his chest. Listen very closely to me. You are not just protecting all of human history here, you are protecting the culmination of the Animosphere family line. Do not do anything to put this in danger. Her eyes glinted dangerously as her voice dropped into a low whisper, or I will make you wish you had never stepped foot in this facility. Ritsuka stared back at her before he nodded once. Yes, director. Olga rolled her jaw, scanning his expression for a few more moments before she stepped back. Good. In that case, get yourselves ready for an immediate rayshift and prepare your initial team of servants for departure. I believe Da Vinci has been working on a faster method of summoning via the crystals, have you not? Still in early progress to make it more portable. Da Vinci grinned. But it will be prepared soon enough. Hopefully by the time you get back, but if I'm as good as I know I am, it should be done about midway through. She paused, depending on the extent of the Singularities' danger. Who knows how long it might go on for? Hopefully not too long. Ritsuka mumbled as he sorted out his shirt and turned around towards the doors. All right, we'll get ourselves ready and head down there. As they swiftly left through the doors, Romani stood up from his chair and went after them. Sorry. He apologized awkwardly as he walked past Olga and Da Vinci. Forgot to tell him something. He chuckled wryly as he scratched the back of his neck. Olga rolled her eyes at him in annoyance while Da Vinci hummed but said nothing, silently watching as he departed the room with a suspicious gleam in her pupils. Ash, Romani called out as he left the room. The saber paused halfway down the corridor and turned around to face him. The doctor silently beckoned him over, causing the saber to approach until they were nearly face to face. Listen, I looked into that thing more and more. And, it's some sort of self-seal. Romani explained in a quiet whisper, frowning as he did so. Your servant container it's limited itself. I think something is blocking you from activating the rest of your true power. The reason the Grail in Okeanos did so much damage to you is because it was trying to break the seal skill but just couldn't get past. Ash nodded along with the explanation. Then how is the seal broken? Romani did a double take. What? No, Ash, you've done this to yourself. He explained, self-seal. I don't know if it was a conscious effort or not, but you've locked away a large part of your own Saint Graph. Ash frowned. That does not make sense. He muttered, reaching up and cupping his chin. For what purpose would I do that? I don't know. Romani admitted with a shrug of his shoulders. But, you have to tell Fujimaru-kun about this. Maybe not the still being alive thing, but at least about the seal skill. If it's mental then, I don't know, there might be a good reason it's locked. As it stands, the seal hampers my strength considerably, Ash countered, clenching his right hand into a fist. Would it not be preferable for me to be at my full power?
There's no guarantee that Fujimaru-kun would survive you at full power. Romani bluntly replied, from what little you've mentioned, when you were back home you'd probably have enough magical energy to you that you'd be comparable to a god rather than a divine spirit. That's a big jump and… He sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose. If you break that, then there's a very real chance you'd burn through Fujimaru-kun in an instant. Ash crossed his arms over his chest, a troubled look coming over his face. I see. Then perhaps I placed the seal on because I knew this? He paused. No, that does not make sense. He muttered. I would not have known his situation until after I was summoned. It's just, Romani pursued his lips. I've been able to identify a couple more skills that were hidden away. From the looks of things, they've only recently been activated as well, like there was some sort of catalyst to trigger them. He raised his hands. This relates to Fujimaru-kun as a master, so please let him know, alright? I will. Ash nodded his head. If nothing else, the possibility of me breaking my seal when contracted to him represents a clear danger to his life. His arms lowered back to his side. I will inform him in due course. However, if I did it to myself, then does that mean I might undo it as well? I thought we just… Forgive me, that was poorly spoken. I mean, what if I did so unintentionally? Romani blinked once before he opened and closed his mouth. I don't know. We shall worry about it when there is more free time available to us. Ash dismissed with a wave of his hand. It has not been broken since my arrival, and there is little to suspect that it shall be broken any time soon. However, I will inform Ritsuka and see if there is some method of separating a contract. From my understanding it comes from magical energy, does it not? Romani nodded his head. Then I will inform him that the contract would need to be broken for his own survival. We shall see if there is some method available to us at a later date. Romani didn't look pleased but slowly nodded his head. Alright then, just so long as you know. There was a pause. I think Leo might be getting suspicious as well, and I really can't keep anything hidden from her for very long. That is my concern. Ash reassured him. So long as she discovers on her own and is not informed by you, I will place no blame upon your shoulders. The saber allowed a ghost of a smile to flicker across his lips. Besides, she has already proven herself to be smarter than you and I. Romani snorted. Yeah, she has. Shaking his head, he looked over the saber's shoulder. You should probably get moving to meet Fujimaru-kun in the Reishift chamber. Ash hummed once in acknowledgement as he turned around and made his way through the hallway, heading in the direction of Ritsuka and Mash while leaving Romani behind. The doctor watched him depart with an odd sense of foreboding. Tempting fate by saying, "It probably won't happen," was a very easy way of saying it was going to happen. Coordinates are locked in place. Romani informed the others in the room as he tapped away on his keyboard, confirmed altitude settings as well, so they won't be falling into the singularity. Unless there has been a substantial shift in the terrain anyway. He added on as an afterthought, as if to try and excuse himself from any blame if something went wrong. Carrie nodded her head near the man. So if they just go falling we can say, hey, it ain't our fault, it's the singularity, this time, right? Maxwell snorted once, as if that will matter much to the director. Munir reached up and scratched under his glasses before adjusting them. She has some reason to be a little annoyed. This is supposed to be some of the most advanced equipment ever constructed when blending magecraft and science, and apparently we can't even tell which way is up or down with it. There was a pause. Although it's most likely due to lingering effects of the explosion that kept us getting it right. Romani coughed into his hand. That aside, is everything looking good across the board? Yeah. Carrie waved her hand and leaned back in her seat. Dials are looking green, so there shouldn't be any further problems with it. All we're missing is the stars of the show. The woman then moved herself forwards and swept her gaze across the room. Still, think they might end up going to the clock tower? They should be so unlucky. Maxwell muttered and crossed his arms over his chest. Can't stand being there for the most part. Really? Carrie snickered loudly. Not a fan of Professor Charisma? Romani sighed, reaching up and rubbing his brows. Seriously? You're not one of them as well, are you? Carrie frowned ever so slightly, tilting her head. What's wrong with you all? She waved her hand. It's just one of those things, isn't it? She turned towards her blonde colleague. You agree with me, don't you, Munir? Not my type. The man responded with a shrug of the shoulders, so I can't say. Bah, you're all being weird about it, I bet, the director. As if on cue, the room to the command center opened up once again with Olga strolling into the room and adjusting her uniform before she looked up and saw Carrie's expression brighten when she saw her. Hey, director? What? Olga asked with a raised eyebrow, turning towards the brunette woman and ignoring the growing looks of horror from everyone else in the room. You'd sleep with Lord El Meloy too as well, right? Olga blinked once. Excuse me. The Chaldeans stepped into the Rashif chamber, all of whom holding entirely different expressions. Ritska and Mash led from the front, the pair occasionally looking over their shoulders with a slight trace of apprehension as the other servants filed into the room behind them. The next one in was Medea. The dark-cloaked woman hovered about a foot above the ground as she entered the room, staring ahead of herself and towards the chamber itself with no small degree of interest. The purple-haired woman hummed quietly to herself as her eyes moved upwards and fixed themselves upon Chaldeas itself. The floating blue orb centered in the circling rings earned her attention as something impressive. It was no small feat to be able to scry through time, and it showcased that even in the dwindling age of mystics, humans were still capable of creating something such as this. If it was simply Medea, then Ritska would have no real concern. The issue was who came into the room after her. Sullivan strode in with an aura of confidence about him, completely ignoring the glare being aimed at his back from a certain blonde-haired saber dressed in dark leathers with a blue furred cape. Ash clenched his jaw so hard that he might as well have turned it into a vice, much to the mild concern of Jean, who stalked in at his side. The saint was sending worried looks between Ash and the pontiff, no doubt sensing the tension between the two of them and questioning the wisdom in allowing the half-fight to accompany them when he so clearly had issues with Ash. Then there was Oda Nobunaga, who looked completely oblivious to the fact that Ash was trying to melt Sullivan with his eyes. Jean frowned ever so slightly, speeding herself up and walking past Sullivan until she came into earshot of the master and shielder duo. I find myself questioning the wisdom in bringing both Ash and Sullivan on this mission, she whispered to him, given they appeared to have no love lost between them. Ritska nodded his head and conceded the point. I'm not asking them to like each other, but I can't have them permanently ignoring each other either. He whispered back to her before looking over his shoulder. And to be honest, I feel like I have to spend some time with Sullivan anyway. I haven't done that all that much since he arrived. Perhaps because he is a difficult person. Ritska turned back around, staring ahead of himself and humming. Maybe. He admitted with a shrug, but I won't know until I try. Very well. Jean nodded, but why bring along Ash if that is the case? Ritska chuckled, because that would be like asking to leave without bringing Mash along. He nodded towards the shielder in question with a wry smile before hastily adding on. Which is to say, I'd never do that. He did more so for the demi-servant's benefit at her sudden look of alarm. Nobunaga looked between Ash's scowl and Sullivan standing a short distance from them with a raised eyebrow, her head flicking between the two of them for a few moments before she eventually spoke up. Are you trying to launch fire from your eyes now? She asked after a few moments. Ash briefly flickered his gaze towards her before it returned to Sullivan. No, I merely have little trust for Sullivan. Ah, all right then. She nodded once, placing her hands on her hips and nodding her head. So he's a traitor, is he? Sullivan is loyal to himself. Ash muttered in response, shaking his head and turning to face Nobunaga, although his eye was still fixed on the pontiff in the corner of his vision. Our goals coincide for the time being. That does not mean he will remain loyal to us. His lip curled downwards. Besides, his actions in the Boreal Valley speak for themselves. Nobunaga had no idea what he was talking about, but the way he spoke indicated it probably wasn't anything pretty. Although one thing took precedence in her mind right now. So, is he gonna betray us on the job? Unlikely. Ash admitted with a begrudging nod of the head. Not worth worrying about then. Is that what you think? He looked down at her with a frown. All those people he murdered in cruel and violent ways, should those be forgotten? Nobunaga raised an eyebrow and nodded towards Sullivan. I mean, he's dead, so I'd say he's sort of paid for that. Ash rolled his jaw and looked up. It is the fact he enjoyed it and is unrepentant. I mean, you don't have to like him to expect him to do his job. The girl replied with a wave of her hand. You're working together now, so it can't be helped. Whether or not you hate him, just try and avoid doing anything about it unless he gives you reason to. Crossing her arms, she then closed her eyes. No sense in starting trouble where none exists. The blonde saber sent one final glare towards Sullivan before he sighed and looked away. In doing so, he missed Sullivan briefly turning his head to stare at the saber from across the room before he returned to gazing at nothing in particular. The intercom buzzed as Romani's voice came over. Coordinates are all set. Fujimaru-kun. Climb into the coffin when you're ready. Nobunaga released a noise somewhere between disbelief and amusement. Are they actually called that, or is that a modern way of telling someone to kill themselves?
Ash grunted behind her. I am told that is simply what they are called, however I also believe it to be somewhat morbid. He admitted with a puzzled frown, I do not understand them either, or why this place is not referred to as the tomb, considering it is full of coffins.
Nobunaga snorted, then looked at him in amusement before she realized he was being literal, which only served to further increase her mirth in the situation, this time raising a hand and covering her mouth to muffle her laughter. Unaware of the conversation happening across from them, Ritsuka turned his head up to the direction of the window showing the command room and raised a thumbs up towards it. Got it. We'll get ready now.
I'm a little excited. Nobunaga grinned to herself as she moved to the center of the room, crossing her arms and tapping her feet while Ritsuka and Mash climbed into their own coffins. A bit sad we haven't been able to get a prototype of the bomb launcher yet though. She lamented with a pout. Jean, who moved to their side, blinked once and looked towards the duo with raised brows. The what launcher?
Bomb launcher. Ash explained to her. Before the alert for the rayshift came in, myself and Nobunaga were in talks with pharaohs regarding a weapon that would launch firebombs. He frowned ever so slightly. In truth, I was hoping that my pre-existing crossbows could be modified to accommodate a new design, but pharaohs has stated that she would never allow me to work off simple designs. I believe were her words. Jean was still staring at them before her expression changed ever so slightly. Do you perhaps mean a cannon? Nobunaga shook her head. Nah. Think of it like a slingshot that fires bombs. Shame. Jean sighed to herself and looked away. Nobunaga and Ash stared at her for a few moments, the former slowly allowing a grin to form on her face. Ho? Nobunaga released an amused noise. Does the saint have a fixation on artillery?
I like the way they sound. ... Nice. Nobunaga gave an approving nod of the head while Ash stood behind her with a raised eyebrow, leaning towards her and whispering.
Are these the same types of weapons that Francis Drake had on her ship? Probably. Giving a single hum, he leaned back and considered the prospect of artillery to himself. His bottomless box made transportation easy enough. There were a variety of weapons that were of absurd sizes yet fit within the fox with relative ease. That's a thoughtful look you have on your face. Nobunaga commented next to him as she stared up. What are you thinking about? Merely other uses of my bottomless box. He replied vaguely as he crossed his arms. There were other aspects to think about, such as materials to construct these weapons. But they could always retrieve them from the Singularity if need be.
Starting unsummon program. The automated voice boomed above their heads. The group of servants shifted their gaze upwards and stared at the glowing lights above them as their surroundings slowly shifted, their bodies being engulfed in a bright light. Initiating spiritron conversion. Ray shift commencing in 3, 2, 1.
And that's them away. Romani remarked as he watched the chamber engulfed with light then die down to reveal the empty room with the two coffins of Ritsuka and Mash still remaining behind. The doctor leaned back into his chair and turned it towards the monitor in front of him and nodded his head. Vitals are looking good. They should be arriving in London any second now. Excellent. Olga nodded her head behind him, crossing her arms and glaring one final time at Carrie, who was staring down at her lap. The white-haired girl clicked her tongue one final time before shifting her expression back to the monitor in front of Romani. Then we should be expecting a communication from them soon. Hopefully. Romani nodded his head, tapping away at his keyboard. A lot of it is still a little scrambled, but that was expected. He added on with a mild shrug of the shoulders. The vitals are still giving off good readings, so there's that. As for London itself, he squinted his eyes. We're getting some telemetry from Mash's shield being sent back. Excellent. Olga nodded her head. Well, looks like it's interfering with the readings as well. The doctor sighed to himself, wincing as he heard the director give an annoyed click of the tongue behind him. To be fair, what little I'm seeing from this is that all of London is blanketed in whatever it is, some sort of magical blanket? The director paused for a moment before a thought came to her. You mean some manner of bounded field? Possibly. Romani hummed. But we'll have to wait for Fujimaru-kun to open up a line of communication with us. He paused in his tappings and leaned forwards on his desk, turning his head towards the director at his side. Until then it's a waiting game for us, unfortunately. Olga made a face at him. You mean to start being a slob now? She almost hissed at him. Find something to do. Get some readings or... Klaxon alarms blared across the entire control room. Both Romani and Olga's eyes snapped onto the monitor and widened in sudden alarm. What is it? Olga asked in a sudden panic as she stared at the flashing warning signs in front of her, soon looking around as the other monitors in the room started to flash with the warning alerts as well. Sudden birth of a singularity. Maxwell informed from his side as he furiously typed away on his monitor. It just appeared now and appears to be growing in rank. What? Olga blanched. But that. Why didn't we? Sheba is locating the source of the new singularity. Carrie added on from her side as she narrowed her eyes at her monitor. Lens has focused on Scandinavia, specifically Denmark. Year at 793 AD. Romani turned towards her and worked on his computer. What historical events occurred at that time? He asked himself before shaking his head and turning back to his desk. Doesn't matter right now, I suppose. He frowned as he continued to work on his keyboard. It's just formed now, so there wasn't any way to detect it. But I thought we needed time to find them. We were already looking in England. Romani replied with a shrug of his shoulders. I guess this one was close enough that we were able to catch it by chance, but who knows how long it's been active. He frowned, continually tapping away at his monitor before he sighed. I can't get in contact with Fujimaru-kun either. We're still having to wait on him to report back to us before we can establish a link. But what about the singularity? Olga demanded as she pointed at the screen. There's one right there and it's alteration to the human foundation order confirmed. Munier called out as his voice rose in alarm as well. It has bypassed C+ rank and jumped to B-. He cut himself off and widened his eyes. It jumped again, now reaching a rank. That's wildly off course. Romani blurted out in alarm. That's the same as the Okeanos singularity. He looked back down at his monitor. Is there any sign that it's slowing down? None. Munier replied back. It might be continually growing. Romani grit his teeth, then slowly looked towards Olga at his side. Director, you're the only one left who has Rayshift compatibility. Olga paled considerably. Wah? She pointed at herself and widened her eyes. But I. You've also got a servant as well. Romani pointed out. We still haven't gotten in touch with Fujimaru-kun, and even if we do, he'll be stuck in London until he resolves the singularity. If we leave this one in Norway, then we run the risk of it growing more dangerous. He turned towards her. You're going to have to go into this one like you did in Septem. Olga opened and closed her mouth repeatedly before she closed her eyes and looked away from Romani, biting into her lower lip and clenching her hands into fists. Fine. She opened her eyes up once again. Tell Da Vinci to prepare me for immediate Rayshift and work on setting those coordinates. She informed the center as she hid her arms behind her back, refusing to allow anyone to see how badly her hands were trembling. Whether that was fear or excitement was something she couldn't tell. She'd done this before. Granted, she had the support of another master who had half a dozen servants, but he was a novice and she was an experienced mage. She could handle this all by herself. Her berserker was also a strong servant who obeyed her orders without question, so there wasn't anything to worry about when it came to giving commands. It would be fine. It was also a recent singularity, so it probably hadn't been around long enough to become something seriously dangerous. Turning around, she made her way towards the doorway and stepped out into the corridor, exhaling as she did so and doing her best to control her rising breathing. This is what she had always wanted to do. She had the opportunity to show that she could do it all by herself. She didn't need anyone else to do the work for her. She could do it. Da Vinci gave her a once-over before nodding her head and stepping back to examine the suit as a whole. We've got the date around early January in 793 AD. She informed the director before she paused, stepping forwards and reaching out with her right hand to brush down the shoulder before smiling to herself. So we've had to dress you up warm for the weather, she informed the woman in a cheerful tone of voice. It serves the same functions of the standard mystic code the other Chaldea personnel had. First aid, momentary reinforcement and emergency evasion. She rattled off before giggling. With the added bonus of keeping you warm. Olga looked down at the snow coat she was wearing, a dull black coloration to it with white fur around the hood of the coat and a thermal mask that she could use to cover her face. The woman rolled her jaw as she held up her gloves and clenched her hands several times before she lowered her left hand and brought up her right to lower the thermal mask. Whatever happened to blending in? She exclaimed the moment her mask was lowered in a tone of disbelief. I'm never going to keep hidden like this. I'll be dealing with Vikings. Pass yourself off as an emissary of the gods. Da Vinci offered with a shrug of the shoulders, you'll have your berserker with you, so it's not like you'd have anything to worry about in terms of the humans living there, and the age of gods in Scandinavia has been over for about 3,000 years. There was a pause. Well, at least since Ragnarok anyway. Olga stared at her for a few moments before she released a stuttered sound. I'm not going to pass myself off as an envoy of Odin when we've confirmed that divine spirits can be summoned into singularities. Da Vinci paused for a moment before she released a quiet hum. In that case, just Traveler would be sufficient. Or do your best to avoid the locals altogether. That worked out in the Singularity in France fairly well, and Denmark is a pretty spacious place around this point in history. The woman then realized something. I guess we figured out the problem though. 793 is the official start of the Age of Vikings, where they spread out and raided all up and down Western Europe and England. If that doesn't happen, then you don't really get all those Viking raids and such. She blinked. You probably wouldn't get Leif Erikson either. Olga clicked her tongue. So you've figured out the issue, have you? She mumbled to herself before she looked towards the entrance to the Rashif chamber. Where is Stahl? She asked herself in an irate tone of voice as she waited for her berserker to arrive. The doors at the far end of the chamber hissed as they raised themselves open. The looming form of the Dragon Slayer armor ducked down as it stepped into the room and moved towards the director. The woman would have been more pleased by its arrival if they had come alone. Unfortunately, they did not.
Pale Rose, Nero exclaimed with a wide grin as she waved her hand, rushing towards her with a beaming grin. You were about to leave without me. I'm almost hurt, but I can understand your concern. She placed a hand on her forehead and dramatically posed in a dramatic version of shock. Refusing to take me to a land full of barbarians and freezing weather just goes to show how much you care about me.
Olga's right eye twitched. However, Nero turned back towards her with a grin. I have decided to brave these conditions to support you. Pale Rose, UMU. She placed a hand over her breasts and puffed out her chest. Well? Are you not glad for my assistance? There was a pause before she waved a hand to her side. I even brought help. Was up my bay. Marie made gang signs as a way of greeting as she skipped to a stop next to Nero, blinking one eye shut as she did so. After a few moments she opened up the eye again and clapped her hands together. Did I do it right? She asked Da Vinci with a hopeful tone of voice. Da Vinci's lower lip wobbled ever so slightly as she looked ready to laugh. Why yes, she got out as a half chuckle, you did.
How? Olga placed her hands on her hips and looked between the two of them. You aren't contracted to me, which means that I can't act as a.
Technically they're contracted with Chaldea. Da Vinci pointed out as she rolled back and forth on her heels. Of course the director knew that. The issue was that the servants didn't, and it was apparent that Olga was desperately trying to get out of taking them with her.
My command seals wouldn't work with them. Da Vinci nodded her head. True, but you'd still work as a source of mana.
Olga glared at her. Hey, are you saying to turn myself into some sort of mere battery?
The genius merely smiled at her in a manner which made it clear her answer was yes, but she wasn't actually going to say it aloud.
She sighed after a few moments and gave the director a more patient look. As it stands, you've got one servant contracted to you, and we don't know what you'd be running into upon arrival. Whether or not your command seals work with them doesn't matter so long as you can support their existence. And she nodded to Nero and Marie before leaning towards Olga and whispering, these two aren't really the sort of servants who would require a command seal to control them. Olga grit her teeth in her jaw. That much was true at least. Even if she did feel unsafe, she had Berserker with her, and Stahl would be able to deal with them in the very unlikely possibility they became a threat.
And rejecting servants when entering a combat situation just reeked of being a bad idea.
Fine. She spoke through gritted teeth as she raised a finger and pointed at the two servants in front of her. But if you're coming, then you are going to obey every one of my orders without question. Whether or not my command seals actually work on you doesn't matter. For the duration of this singularity you will treat me in the exact same manner as you would treat your own master, understood? Alright, the two answered at the same time in positive affirmations. Olga kept her gaze with them for a few more moments before she sighed again and turned her attention back onto the genius. You can control the contracts from the command room?
We can change the designated mana source, yes. Da Vinci nodded along. They'd still be contracted to Fujimaru, but you'd be their anchor in the singularity, so it's all good. She grinned, raising a thumbs up. Of course, if you make contracts with any servants in the singularity, then you'll be fine.
Olga merely grunted in response as she turned away from the genius and made her way to her coffin and stood in front of it. raising a hand and pressing the button on it to open it up. "Just get me ready to deploy," she curtly spoke, prompting a roll of the eyes from Da Vinci. The genius turned away from her and started to make her way out of the room as Romani got to work in the command center, locking into the rayshift coordinates and preparing the group for transit. There was a flash of light within the field of ice. The group emerged in the frozen tundra and were instantly set upon with chilly winds. Olga grumbled behind her coat mask as she raised her hand to her head and pulled down her goggles to cover her face, frowning to herself before she raised up the communicator to her front. "Romani," she called through the winds. The man's face flashed up a few moments later. "I thought Denmark wasn't supposed to?" "Looks like problems with the local weather." Romani's voice crackled through the communicator, probably caused by whatever Grail is currently located here, if there is one, or just the disruption of history leading to an onset of magical energy causing problems with the climate. Olga grumbled quietly to herself before she cast her sight around herself and frowned ever so slightly. She could see Nero and Marie looking none too pleased by the sudden drop in temperatures while Stahl maintained their usual posture, seemingly uncaring as to the situation as a whole. "You're looking at about -15 degrees Celsius," Romani informed her through the communicator once again. "Which is colder than it normally is in Denmark in this time of year but not unmanageable. Good news is that the link between yourself and the two other servants is holding strong, so they should be fine." "Romani," she cut him off and frowned at him behind her visage. "Where am I?" Ah, he blinked and nodded his head. "You're about 10 miles away from what will become Ribe," he informed her with a faint smile. "It started off as a trading town set up about 40 years ago for when you are. The population shouldn't be too great, but it should get you some information on what is happening and then move on from there to see what you can resolve." He raised a thumbs up over the screen and gave her the best smile he could manage. If she hadn't been wearing goggles, Romani would have been treated to a look that would have made a desert envious of how dry it was. Shaking her head at him, she clicked the communicator screen off and lowered it back to her side as she turned to see Nero and Marie stood not far from her with equal expressions of discomfort on their faces. The pair rubbing their arms and looking around at the cold. "I say," Nero called out over the storm as she continued to rub her arms, "it is indeed cold here, is it not? It's Scandinavia in the middle of winter." Olga couldn't help but snap back at her with annoyance, gesturing to the clouds above her head with a pointed finger. "Of course it's going to be cold. Not to mention what manner of harm the Grail is doing to the local weather pattern." "All right." Nero raised her hands in a placating fashion as she looked around. "I merely suggest that we find somewhere warm." There was a pause before she blinked and went to her side, unveiling her sword once again. "Wait a moment." The sword burst into flames, a faint heat emanating from the weapon which managed to bring a faint sigh of relief from Marie at standing so close to the new source of heat. Nero beamed and waved the burning sword about. "I truly am a genius." Olga rolled her eyes behind her goggles and started to walk forwards. The heavy footfalls of Stahl thumped out across the ground behind her as the lumbering titan started to move in step with her, soon followed by Nero falling into step at her side with an overly positive grin on her face while Marie matched her enthusiasm with a skip to each of her steps. "We'll have to find something warmer for the two of you to wear," Olga pointed out as they continued to walk onwards. "Either that or you'll have to convert to spirit form. And deprive the locals of seeing my beauty." Nero sounded positively horrified at the notion. "These poor barbarians have likely never seen a figure as lovely as mine. And it's because of that reason I'd like to keep your interactions with them to a minimal." "Ah, are you jealous?" Nero gave a throaty chuckle and shifted her expression to be more smug. "I'm truly flattered, but my beauty is for all to enjoy, pale rose." "Stop calling me that," Olga growled under her breath, "and I'm more worried about if one of them gets handsy and you end up reacting and putting a hole through their chest." "You make me sound so violent." Nero pouted and looked away. Marie leaned forwards slightly and raised an eyebrow. Would they actually approach someone who is able to withstand these cold temperatures and be able to wield a sword that is lit on fire? The French queen couldn't help but ask as she found a slight flaw in the plan. "Shut up," Olga snapped back. She sighed and lowered her forehead into her left palm and growled words under her breath before another thought came to mind. She turned to Marie. "You're a rider, aren't you?" "Yes. Then can't you just carry us on your mount?" The French queen blinked several times before she made an O shape with her mouth and snapped her fingers. "I can do that," she realized with a wide smile. "You're right." She reached up and slipped her right hand between Olga's hood and gently pat her cheek twice. Nice call.
Olga leaned away from her fingers as if they had been made of molten steel, prompting a brief look to pass across the queen's face before she thinned her lips and turned back to the snow. Raising her ring, she placed a deft kiss upon it before flinging her arm out and forming a carriage made of crystals. As she lowered her hand, she turned around and looked up at the berserker. I don't think they'll fit though. Stahl can keep pace alongside us. Olga informed the group with a wave of the hand and dismissed the notion as she walked towards the carriage before a faint frown came upon her face as she examined it. This will take us the rest of the way. Marie nodded with a confident look on her face. Fine. Olga grumbled quietly and moved towards the door, pulling it open and stepping into the carriage interior, not before turning and giving Stahl one final command. Revert to spirit form and keep pace with us. If I give the signal, revert back.
The berserker faded away without a word. Marie climbed into the carriage alongside Olga and shifted in her seat until she was comfortable, soon followed by Nero bundling herself into the wagon and slotting herself down opposite them with an odd look on her face as she examined the interior. While it doesn't look like it from the outside, it is surprisingly comfortable here, isn't it? Her voice contained a clear note of intrigue before she turned to the one responsible for it. There was a slight jolt before the carriage started to roll forwards, being pulled along by crystalline horses at the front. Marie accepted the praise with a nod of the head and a beaming smile. Quite so, if you're going to move around then it is best to do so in luxury, isn't it? She then leaned forwards with a conspiratorial look on her face. Now then, since it's just us and we have no other way of passing the time. She giggled like a child before throwing herself back into her seat and spreading her arms wide as best she could. Girl talk. Olga stared out the window of the carriage, gazing at nothing but the horizon of snow and ice and regretting ever coming here to begin with. Girl talk? Nero tilted her head slightly in confusion. Is it talk that isn't supposed to involve men? She looked to Olga and then back to Marie. What are we supposed to talk about? Marie opened her mouth to respond, then paused and looked down for a moment before she shrugged. I don't really know. She admitted after a few moments before she looked back up and opened her mouth to continue on. We could always not speak and ride in silence so as to not be distracted if we are attacked. Olga spoke in a strangled tone of voice that was barely able to hide away her clear annoyance at the situation, turning around to face them and raising up the goggles on her face to showcase her irritation at them. We are here to resolve a crack in history, not to mingle in childish games where we might. You need to have sex. Bawa. Olga choked out and stared at Nero with wide eyes, the emperor giving blunt and crude advice with a perfectly straight face. It's what we used to do regularly. Nero carried on with a wave of the hand and a calm smile on her face as she leaned back into her chair and continued speaking as though recalling a pleasant encounter with a friend rather than an adventure in debauchery. Specifically, we had large orgies. She elaborated further, very good for relieving stress. Olga continued to stare at her with wide eyes before she clenched her jaw shut and looked away with a furious blush on her face. I'm not even going to entertain that idea. Why not? Nero asked with a puzzled expression as if she couldn't comprehend the answer to begin with. It's all good, isn't it? You also get to loosen up a bit? I am not going to engage in some sort of depraved pastime by engaging in random acts of intercourse like some floozy. Ah, Marie looked at her as if seeing her in a new light. You want to sleep with someone special. Olga was very tempted to scream aloud. She likely would have done it if Romani's face didn't pop up at that moment. She was surprised at how glad she was to see him, which certainly said a lot about their current situation. The man's face was one of mild concern as he looked between her and a monitor to their left. Yeah, director? We're picking up a servant's signature ahead of you. Olga tensed herself. How close? A few hundred meters. He continued on, frowning as he did so. It hasn't moved to intercept you and it didn't show up until a few moments ago. He thinned his lips and turned back to her. Either it is an assassin dropping their presence concealment, which would be utter stupidity. Olga grunted in response, crossing her arms and nodding her head before her eyes widened slightly, or it's a freshly summoned servant, likely caused by the Grail or whatever else is interfering in history. He finished her sentence with a nod of the head, so I'd advise being cautious about approaching them. Olga turned to Marie at that moment. Slow the carriage down, she informed her as she rose up from her seat and steadied herself in the jerky movements of their transport, and prepare for a confrontation if they prove hostile. The other two servants nodded their heads in response. Olga waited until the carriage slowed right the way down before she clicked open the door and jumped down into the snow, turning towards the direction of the servant and making a mental note to keep Berserker on standby if they were an enemy. She then blinked as she found herself staring at the figure silhouetted against the snow, pitch-black plate armor with a square-shaped helmet. The figure stared at them from a distance as the other two servants departed from the carriage and faced the figure down. The Black Knight was certainly tall, arms crossed in front of his chest with a long black greatsword holstered on his back underneath a rectangular tower shield. The head moved between the group for a few moments before the knight slowly uncrossed his arms and raised his right hand upwards as if to give a signal. Olga tensed herself for an attack and was very nearly ready to call out to Berserker. "Hello." Then the imposing figure spoke in perhaps the softest voice she had ever heard in her entire life. Not only that, but it lacked any sort of negative emotion to it at all. Almost as if she had been greeted by a child and not a warrior of ancient history. So surprising was it that she found herself dumbfounded for several seconds as she stared at the knight. The man slowly lowered their hand and drew it back to their side when they got no response. "Is that how it's supposed to go?" They asked once again, this time sounding much less confident. "Did I forget to say good morning?" They looked upwards and found themselves staring at a swirl of dark storm clouds and falling snow. "Is it morning?" "It is afternoon." They looked back down, their voice shifting into a more nervous one. "Did I get it wrong?" "No, Marie assured him, stepping forwards and giving them a wide welcoming smile. "We think it's morning as well, but the weather is so poor you can't tell." Oh. The knight released a sigh of relief and let their shoulders fall as tension fled their body. "That's good, I got worried there for a moment." "It is also a bit nippy, isn't it?" they commented as an afterthought. They puffed themselves up. "My name is Saber, my class is Tarkus of Black Iron." "Ah, wait, no, I got those the wrong way round." A light chuckle left the suit of armor as they reached up and scratched the side of their helmet awkwardly and looked away from them in an embarrassed fashion. "Can I try that again?" "Can we keep him?" Marie asked in a low whisper as she stared at the knight with no small degree of amusement. Olga felt her eye twitch once again. Here not even 10 minutes and the first servant they encountered who could prove an ally was an imbecile. "And, hello Tarkus. An innocent young man who can punch you hard enough to shatter your skull into pieces. He's just a nice guy with a light voice. But yes, this singularity is going to be an Olga-focused one. The moment in which she gets drumroll. Character development. It also means that Singularity 4 is taking place alongside this but won't be covered until this singularity is over. Suffice to say there is a lot going on there and things aren't quite as they seem. Anyway, stats. Black Iron Tarkus Servant, Saber. Strength, A+. Endurance, A. Agility, D. Mana, D. Luck, X. Noble Phantasm, A++ Sense Fortress, A++, Labyrinth, Max Target, 20, Max Range, 0. The Fortress Maze he was famous for being the first to ever clear, he can manifest it around himself and his opponents. A thaumaturgy on the same level as a reality marble. Hostile to all opponents he brings in, occupied by demons and snake men of old. Class skills. Writing. E magic resistance, C personal skills. Knight of Berenike, A+. Famed for their strength and prowess, Tarkus is no different. Provides A+ to his strength. Black Iron, A+ boosts endurance. Provides equal resistance to fire-based attacks. Battle continuation. A pioneer of the stars, X Sen's fortress, which had routed all those who attempted to venture into it for over 100 years, was overcome by this man. A labyrinth which had been regarded as impossible to cross was brought down to simply being improbable. Vanquisher of the Golem. B+ his defeat of the Iron Golem means he has a strong advantage against constructs made by mages. Poor balance. A conceptual weakness on his part due to how he died. If he is in a high enough location then it is very easy for him to fall and either cripple himself in combat or outright die if the fall would be enough to kill a normal person. As such he likes to avoid high places. Summoning, Oh, right, yes. Hello, I'm Saber. My true name is Tarkus. Hope to help you. Dialogue 1, so, just between you and me, don't put me in high up places, I'm not very good with them, poor balance. Dialogue 2, have you ever tried those sweets? They're very tasty, How can I taste them when I'm an undead? Am I not supposed to be able to? Dialogue 3, master and servant. I just do what you say, right? Then that's about it really. Just don't make me do something really bad, alright? Dialogue 4. If you have Night King Rendell, oh, the Balder King, yes, I know him. He wants to explore my noble phantasm and give it another go. I don't want to say no, but what if he ends up dying? Dialogue 5. If you have Jeanne d'Arc Alter, you have very pretty hair, Miss Alter. Sorry. Mother used to say that I should always speak nicely of pretty girls. Dialogue 6. If you have Marie Antoinette, she's a very nice lady, isn't she? She always says very nice things to me whenever we speak. I like her. I mean as a friend, a friend. Dialogue 7. If you have Mordred, there's no need to be rude all the time, Miss Mordred. Ow! Stop hitting me in the head. What? But you're a girl, ouch.
Dialogue 8. If you have the chosen undead. Ah, hello again. Nice to see you. Sorry about the mess in the church, by the way. Guess I'm a little clumsy.
Dialogue 9. If you have nursery rhyme, morning nursery, did you want to ride on my shoulders again? Dialogue 10. If you have Quetzalcoatl, she's energetic, but I think she's a very nice lady. Also when she smiles with her sharp teeth, it's, no, it's not scary, I just, never mind.
Dialogue 11. If you have Avisbron. Oh, they make golems, do they? I'll stay away from him then. No, I don't hate him, I'm just very good at breaking golems and I'd feel terrible if I ruined all his hard work. Dialogue 12. If you have Kintoki. Yeah, Golden, why do we keep shouting that out anyway? But he's a very nice man. See you later, Mr. Kintoki.
Dialogue 13. If you have Minamoto no Raiko, I always make sure to be polite to Miss Raiko. She has this sort of feeling that reminds me a bit of mother sometimes, but I won't call her mom by mistake. That would be very embarrassing for me. What do you mean she wouldn't mind? Dialogue 14. If you have Barguest, Miss Barguest. She gets these strange looks when she's near me sometimes. Also there's some weird thing about drool every now and again. She always apologizes for it though and says she is working on getting better. I don't know what is wrong, but I'll make sure to cheer her on. Dialogue 15. If you have other Pioneer of the Stars servants. Wow, they're all so amazing. I just walked through the maze. It didn't seem that hard to me. Is that the wrong thing to say?
Dialogue 16. If you have Asterios. Good morning, Mr. Asterios. You're looking very healthy again today. Are you off to see Miss Euryale? Alright, have fun.
Likes things that I like. Well, sweets. What? They taste nice. Hates things that I don't like. Well, I don't like rude people. Mother always said that if you don't have anything nice to say, then you shouldn't say anything at all. Wish for the Holy Grail. A sweet shop. No, I'd like to run a sweet shop.
Bond level 1. I haven't been a servant before, so I'm trying my best. How am I doing so far?
Bond level 2. Hey, Master. What do you normally do for fun around here? Not that I'm asking that we just bunk off work, but I think it would be nice to do something. Bond level 3. Stuff I used to do for fun? Let's see, Mother used to say I was a dragon in the kitchen. She said it was because I burned everything and somehow stayed alive despite my own best efforts to kill myself.
Bond level 4. If male master. Do you think some of the ladies around here are a bit pretty? I do. I sometimes get a little nervous and shut my eyes when speaking to them. I think some of them are catching on though.
Bond level 4. If female master. Do you want to know a secret? Sometimes I close my eyes when talking to you. It's just, I get a little nervous when you look at me. Bond level 5. Come on. Master, let's go. I'm looking forward to it. Also, can I call you a friend from now on? I can? Yes? Birthday, happy birthday, Master. I tried to make you something in the kitchen, but, Mr. Emma saw me and, well, he said he'd cook you something on my behalf. During an event. Hey, do you think we should go out and see what everyone is talking about? I think we should.
First ascension. Hey, does my armor feel a bit lighter or is it just me? Second ascension. Hey, look, I can balance crashing noises. I'll work on it.
Third ascension. I'm still not good at balancing though, but I can try a jump. What do you mean I'll fall through the floor?
Fourth ascension. Thanks for believing in me all this time, Master. I'll do my best to make you happy.
Chapter 119. Snow and Ash. The group stared at the black armored knight as he seemingly shifted awkwardly in front of him. The black knight raised a fist to the front of his helmet and coughed once before he thumped his fist twice on his chest as if trying to clear his throat. Despite the fact that he probably wouldn't have been able to achieve anything on account of the half-inch of rolled steel currently hanging off the front of his body. Not that he seemed to register that slight problem as he started again. Anyway, his voice came back full of confidence and still maintaining that childlike tone to it. I'm Tarkus. My class is Saber. He muttered a quiet cheer under his breath before he continued on, and I am. He trailed off, then fell into a long silence. Olga stared at him unblinkingly for a few moments before he rolled her jaw and spoke up in a slightly strained tone of voice. You have been summoned? Yes, I have been summoned. He nodded his head at her. Thank you, miss. Despite the fact his words could have been construed as sarcastic, his tone of voice contained nothing but genuine gratitude. It was utterly baffling for the woman to behold. Are any of you my master? Olga felt a hand gently rest on her back and then found herself shambling forwards for around a foot, flinching in surprise before she shot a look over her shoulder and found herself staring at Marie's encouraging expression, the French queen giving her a thumbs up and an encouraging smile. Giving the writer an annoyed click of the tongue, she slowly turned back to Tarkus and started to walk towards him, still keeping Berserker on standby, and halted her movements at least several meters from the servant. I am Olga Marie Animosphere, director of Chaldea. She pointed towards him. Why have you been summoned here? Tarkus remained silent for a few moments. I got told to come here, he responded slowly and in a very unsure tone of voice, looking left and right before he leaned forward slightly and sounded very nervous. Was I not supposed to? What? Olga did a double take at him, feeling her annoyance slowly start to rise. No, you idiot, she snapped at him, and to her surprise, he actually flinched at her sudden rise of volume. I mean, why are you specifically summoned here? Do you not have a master already? And no, he stepped back then nodded his head more confidently. No? Fine then. Taking in a deep breath, she composed herself and puffed up her appearance. Then from this moment on, I shall be your master. Her eyes narrowed behind her goggles. I expect you to obey my every command if you are to be my servant, are we clear? Tarkus raised his hands and tapped his fingers together, a gentle hum leaving his helmet as he seemingly considered something before looking behind her to the other servants. He must have seen something. The director resisted the urge to whirl around and see what they were doing behind her, because he gave a single nod and slowly moved towards her while extending his right hand like he was about to try and shake hers. Okay, he continued on as he waddled towards her, I'll be your servant. There was a pause as he stopped just in front of her. Just, don't make me do anything bad, alright? Bad would be not obeying your master. She growled at him as she extended a hand of her own and clasped his, finding that his own gauntlet very nearly dwarfed her palm. The actual servant himself was towering above her, at least 6'5". She felt a slight jolt run through her body as she forged a contract with the servant. The minor twinge of pride was quickly stamped out when she realized that this one was an idiot. Have you been informed of anything in regards to this singularity? She asked as she retracted her limb to her side and placed it on her hip, staring up at the servant expectantly. Tarkus slowly shook his head at her and she found herself disappointed and unsurprised by the answer. TCH. She waved a hand at him while giving an annoyed click of the tongue, turning back around and walking towards the carriage. Just get in and keep silent. Okay, he muttered again, slumping slightly as if he was a child who had recently been scolded. Marie was staring at Nero with a mildly disapproving look on her face, whispering to her as they walked past the rider. Do you need to be so rude to him? As long as he does his job, what does it matter? She bluntly replied back, bundling herself into the carriage and sitting down, crossing her arms and returning to merely glaring out the window across the snowy tundra. It probably wouldn't matter how she treated him anyway. The servant would just as likely speak ill of her inside his own mind regardless of how she acted. She ground her teeth together in her jaw. They were all the same, smiling at her as if they thought she couldn't see their mocking expressions. The only one exempt from this was Stahl, and they were just a mindless golem. The carriage lurched to the side, Olga giving a panicked gasp as she turned to see Tarkus very nearly pull the entire vehicle over as he climbed in. The saber paused when he saw the expression on his new master's face. He turned his head to the side and looked down in a manner that clearly showed his shame. Sorry, mother always said I don't care. Alright, he whispered again, climbing inside and shutting the door behind him, hunching his body over as he sat down and resting his arms on his knees. Marie laid a gentle hand on his shoulder and tapped him twice in an effort to comfort him.
Tarkus released a noise of acknowledgement, turning towards Marie for a moment before he turned back to staring at the ground.
There was a groan and a muffled neigh before the carriage started to pick up once again, carrying the group onwards. The command room was silent as the group stared at the monitor, all of them having been party to hearing the director's recruitment of the freshly summoned Saber.
The room remained silent, only the tapping on the keyboards could be heard as the operators managed the information of the readings they were getting from both the Scandinavian and London teams.
Still nothing from Fujimaru-kun? Romani asked as he looked away from his own screen towards Carrie. The man was visibly worried about the lack of contact, although some could tell that wasn't all that concerned him. Still nothing. Carrie confirmed with a nod of the head before she exhaled and leaned back in her seat. Right, if no one else is going to say anything.
Carrie. Maxwell spoke up from his own seat, sounding more exhausted and resigned than anything else. Don't. It's not worth it. No, that was perhaps the worst recruitment I've ever heard in my life. She exclaimed as she pointed at the screen. The Saber approaches her like the gentlest guy I've ever heard in my life, and her first response is to say, "Shut up and become my glorified slave," and the fact he doesn't just flip out as is. You say that like servants aren't just familiars. Munier commented from his own station, then raised his hand. I know that's just the simplest way of putting it, but they are basically familiars with sentience and a personality to them. He sighed, reaching up and rubbing the bridge of his nose under his glasses, but yeah, that was. She's just getting used to it. Romani excused her with a faint smile. Besides, not every master can be like Fujimaru-kun. He pointed out with a nod of the head, gesturing to the screen of the boy in question. We're just used to Fujimaru-kun being much more approachable.
There's not being approachable and then there's being an asshole. Carrie grunted under her breath, shaking her head and looking away. This is gonna end badly. Just give her time. Romani pleaded, she'll get there, just give her time is all. She did well in Rome, so. Yes, yes. Maxwell sighed, giving a wave of his right hand before he returned to his monitor. She'll get the hang of it, whatever. Let's just keep an eye on the Singularities. He turned around and faced the room. We can complain about her all we like, but we need to support her to resolve this singularity in the same way we need to support Fujimaru. The room was silent, Romani sending the man a thankful nod of the head which he responded to with a grunt as he turned his chair back around. That being said, I'd advise you to talk to her, Romani. The man continued on, at the very least remind her that servants probably work best if they actually like their master. Romani grimaced slightly and looked down, tapping his fingers on his desk and sighed. That much was true. In terms of master compatibility, the director had been ranked as one of the worst possible contenders for the role of master. The fact she had been able to summon a servant at all had been nothing shy of miraculous. However, it made sense when it was understood that the berserker she summoned was nothing more than a golem. Without a will of their own, it didn't matter what her master compatibility was if it meant they would obey her every word without question and lacked a personality. It was having other servants alongside them that gave him pause. The director had a very difficult personality and the results didn't lie. She was a not very good master. Romani raised his head back up and stared at the monitor. They're currently on track to get close to where modern-day Ribe is located. They'll be there within the next 20 minutes. Keep an eye on the readings as they travel. Something caused this singularity to jump up rapidly within a few minutes, so be on the alert. He leaned back into his chair and fixed his eyes back on the readings for London. By all accounts, it still looked as though all was going well. The only issue was they hadn't communicated with them yet, so either something was blocking them or they were just preoccupied. Whatever the case, it was best to focus their efforts on the singularity that they could actually monitor successfully. Much as he didn't like it, he would have to focus on the director before worrying about Fujimaru. There wasn't much choice, that was just all he could do at the moment. The carriage trundled along, occasionally jumping slightly as they ran over an odd bit of ground. The movements would cause Tarkus' armor to clang together and produce a metallic drumming sound. The mild irritation was made worse by the fact that Tarkus himself refused to sit still for more than 5 seconds without doing something, either tapping away on his knee with his fingers or turning to look out of the window of the carriage. Each movement caused his armor to make yet more noise. Olga felt her eye twitch in annoyance, turning to face the servant with an irritable scowl before she clicked her tongue and looked away once again. The silence didn't last forever though. Nero decided that she would be the one to break it. So, Saber. She grinned. Tarkus jolted and continued to stare out the window. Tell us of yourself. Me.
He made a noise of surprise and pointed to himself as if somehow expecting there to be another saber that Nero intended to speak with and had somehow snuck in between them without him noticing. Of course. Nero nodded her head. Someone of your stature and polite disposition must have a story to tell, must they not? She inquired, leaning forwards and cupping her chin. I do not know your name, which means you must come from the other world. She proclaimed as if it wasn't obvious.
I suppose, Tarkus replied with a slight shrug of his shoulders. I mean, yes, I am. I'm a knight from Balder, I was one of Sir Berenike's. Nero nodded along. Were they all as imposing as you?
Actually, I was shorter than most of them. He admitted with a faint chuckle, reaching up and scratching the chin of his helmet, but mother always said that all that mattered was being big in heart if not in body. He proclaimed with a cheery tone of voice, earnestness bleeding into his words, so that must mean I have a big heart. He paused for a moment as he looked around. Actually, you're all shorter than me, so you must have big hearts as well, right?
Nero stared at him in silence for a few moments before her eyes brightened considerably and she pressed a hand into her rightmost breast. The movement caused Tarkus to swiftly look away from her and back out of the window. Not even registering the motion, Nero started to speak in an exceedingly boastful tone. Otherwise known as her normal voice. She grinned widely. I do indeed have a big heart. How else could you explain how generous I am to the people? She waved her arm across the carriage towards Tarkus. You must have quite the perception to notice such a fact about me within moments of meeting me, although I suppose it is rather obvious, is it not? Why yes, right. Tarkus nodded his head, still not directly facing her and opting to stare from the window, then paused and slowly turned back towards Nero and then towards Marie, finally at Olga before he returned to the other two servants. Sorry if this sounds abrupt, but aren't you cold? Yes. Nero admitted after a moment with a sullen nod of the head, pouting and gazing at the weather in a forlorn fashion. Every instinct is telling me to bundle myself within a dozen warm blankets and cloaks to protect myself from this godless cold, but that would deprive everyone the beauty of seeing my peerless body. Tarkus tilted his head. I don't mean to be rude, miss, but I would much prefer you to be warm and comfortable than anything else. His response was earnest and innocent as he gestured to her. It's much too cold outside and I think you should dress more warmly. Nero frowned ever so slightly, but in this chill, the people who live there would need every bastion of beauty they might find. She pointed at herself. What sort of emperor would I be if I didn't appeal to the needs of the masses? Tarkus made a noise in response. I don't know about all that, miss. I just don't like the idea that you're getting cold. He paused and then hummed. Although I don't think that there's anything you can make a cloak out of. He realized with a sad tone of voice as he looked down. Sorry, miss. Do not worry yourself about it, Nero assured him with a wave of her hand. Although the fact you care so deeply for my beautiful figure warms my heart, and surely it is that love that will keep me warm even in these bitter winds. All right. Tarkus nodded his head, accepting the reasoning without another word before he realized something. I realized I never asked for your names. That was rude of me. He looked between the rider and Saber. Sorry, Mrs. That is our blunder. Nero shook her head at him before she crossed her arms and puffed herself up. I am Emperor Nero Claudius of Rome. I'm Marie Antoinette. The platinum blonde to his right introduced herself with a soft voice and a gentle smile, bowing her head ever so slightly at him. Queen of France. Tarkus froze in the wake of their introductions. He slowly raised his right hand, pointing a finger at Nero. Emperor? The shaky finger turned towards Marie. Queen? He squeaked out. The girl nodded her head once before she shifted her face, her mouth morphing into a concerned frown as she saw the way the knight's arm dropped to his side. Is there something the matter? I am so sorry, miss, he loudly apologized as he dropped his head down as far as he could. I have been so rude to you, I should have been more respectful. Mother always said to speak politely to your betters and I've been speaking much too casually. He released a strangled noise as he turned to Nero. Pete, please accept my apologies for telling you how to dress, Miss Nero. Nero blinked at the sudden shift in personality, looking thoroughly taken aback. Marie was swift to respond, resting a hand on the knight's right shoulder. Don't worry about a thing, Tarkus. She patted the knight gently. You can treat us exactly the same. I don't mind. There was a pause. Actually, I would prefer you to. Nero nodded her head. We are not in Rome anymore and I would prefer you to speak with me more candidly. There was a pause. Also, your polite way of speaking is very appealing. It is much more preferable to this fearful tone. But, Tarkus looked between the two of them before his shoulders dropped. I don't want to be rude, Miss Marie, Miss Nero. It's not rude if we're asking you. Marie assured him gently, I would prefer a friend to a subject anyway. Tarkus released a light chuckle at her words. I don't think I could be friends with such pretty ladies, Miss Marie. Marie raised an eyebrow at him and presented him with a playful smirk, all the while Nero preened at the praise. The Black Iron Knight eventually realized what he had just said. An embarrassed noise escaped his helmet before he swiftly turned in his seat and returned to staring out the window. Please forget I said that, he all but begged. Will you stop talking nonsense? Olga hissed from her side of the carriage. What are you even playing at? Tarkus looked away once again, staring down at the floor with a hint of shame and guilt. The move managed to earn a frown from Marie, who turned to the director and leveled an unimpressed stare upon her. There's no need to be rude. She chided the woman. We're merely speaking with one another. Isn't it expected for a team to have some measure of communication with one another to be successful? What does that have to do with asking him why he won't look at you? Olga scoffed, shaking her head and looking away from the group in annoyance. You're not even discussing anything relating to our current situation. You're just speaking of nothing even remotely relevant. If something happens, then we can engage in conversation about what it was, but until such a time then I would strongly recommend that. Well, then. Nero cut her off and turned to Tarkus, giving him an unusually serious look. I assume you do battle in a straightforward manner, given your attire and choice of weaponry? Ah, yes. Tarkus nodded his head at her. I'm not very good at fighting tricky, so I just use my strength. He pointed towards his arm. Mother always told me to play to my strengths, and mine is, well, he awkwardly chuckled as he realized where that sentence was leading. Your strength? Nero surmised with an amused twinkle in her eyes. Have you any special skills? Just boosting my strength and toughness. He thumped a fist into his chest before he paused for a few moments. Also something to do with the stars, but I don't know about that. Stars? Olga shifted in her seat and turned towards him when she heard that. Her head inclined ever so slightly and her tone changed from annoyance to befuddled curiosity. What do you mean by stars? Pioneer. He paused when he saw several surprised looks aimed at him. What? Pioneer of the stars. Romani's voice cried out through the communicator on Olga's wrist. His face flashed into existence soon after and looked thoroughly dumbstruck by it. Really? What did you do? That's a skill that only those who shifted the course of humanity have access to, like Tesla or Francis Drake. Or me. Da Vinci's face cut through Romani's feed, her own expression behind one of palpable excitement. So, what did you do, my darkly armored friend? It must have been something special to earn you that sort of ranking. What impossible deed did you do in life? Impossible? Tarkus tilted his head slightly. What do you mean impossible? Da Vinci blinked once before she shook her head. Mamma mia. She muttered under her breath before facing the man once again, this time sporting an expression that looked close enough to lecturing. Tarkus recognized the look as the same one his mother would give him whenever she was about to tell him something important. Listen closely. Da Vinci raised a single finger, placing a pair of glasses on her head with her other hand. A pioneer of the stars is not just someone who performs a task that is exceedingly difficult, they are one that performs a task that was regarded as, quite literally, impossible. Acts that break the boundary for what humanity thought they could achieve. Understand? Takrus was still for a few moments before he nodded his head once. I think so? I did something that people didn't think they could do? Yeah. She nodded her head. That's a simple way of doing it and kind of plays down the achievement, but I doubt that you actually mean it in a malicious way. She paused, cupping her chin. So I can only assume you got yours via the same sort of method as Francis Drake. So is there anything you did that others regarded as really difficult? The Black Knight crossed his arms and gave a quiet hum as he thought to himself for a few moments. Well, there was Sen's fortress. Everyone said that was really difficult. A fortress? Da Vinci replied with a strained expression, but still not disappointed. Was there anything special about it? It was supposed to grant entry into an Orlando. He pointed out with a bit of excitement in his voice as he turned back to her. That was supposed to be hard. Supposed to? Nero raised an eyebrow before she looked around. In an Orlando. City of the gods. Da Vinci supplied. Think of Olympus. She clarified for the Roman emperor, who now looked at Tarkus with something more akin to surprise at mild interest. So you got into an Orlando. Yes.
Tarkus nodded his head, then paused and realized something. I don't think anyone else had done so before me. He reached up and scratched his head, but I don't get it. I just walked forwards and got to the end. It didn't seem that hard to me.
Romani's face flashed up again, this time with a great deal of understanding. Well, that would explain the X-ranked luck. The man realized with a dry laugh and a faint shake of the head. You just walked your way into changing the course of human history and didn't even realize you were doing it. That's impressive. I don't think that's it, right? Tarkus looked around the carriage for support. I mean, it probably wasn't that amazing anyway. Did you actually get into the city? Yeah, he chuckled nervously and looked away from the group. But, I slipped. You slipped? Yeah, like, you fell over? A hum accompanied by a nod. So, well, I was trying to find a way across this bridge. Tarkus explained with an embarrassed voice. And there was this church that went across the gap, so I went in there and walked along the rafters. He paused, then pointed a finger at himself. I'm a little clumsy. Oh, Romani made a strained expression at him. Ooh. Da Vinci's face cropped back in again, looking blank. So let me get this straight. You managed to just walk through a maze of the gods which was apparently so difficult it was regarded as impossible to do. She nodded at him. Given that you possess the skill, and upon gaining access to the city of the gods after braving this impossible fortress, you then slip and fall to your death? Yes. Tarkus nodded after a moment's hesitation before he looked down at his lap and tapped the tips of his index fingers together. You can laugh if you want, it's a bit silly. It's not that funny. Marie reassured him from the side. It's actually quite tragic, she added on with a mild frown. Meh. Tarkus shrugged his shoulders. It's pretty embarrassing. I mean, I would laugh at it. Olga stared at him in pure silence before she spoke up again. Anything else to inform me of? If I fall from a high place, I'll probably die. He responded quickly. I don't know how I know that, I just do. A pause. It seems pretty obvious for me to avoid high places, and also, I'm not a big supporter of heights. The director closed her eyes and inhaled through her nose before she exhaled through her mouth. The eyes opened back up, a conceptual weakness to heights then. She surmised, in that case, it would be best that you stay at ground level at all times. Okay. Tarkus nodded his head once before Da Vinci spoke up again. Well, I suppose not every pioneer can be a genius or master inventor, but braving an impossible fortress and succeeding is still a very impressive feat. The woman smiled to herself and leaned back. So, from one pioneer to another, I offer you my warmest welcome. Thanks, miss. Leonardo da Vinci. The brunette boasted as she flicked her hair over her shoulder as if to try and show off more of her face. It was as she turned back to Tarkus that she noticed something off. He wasn't actually facing her directly, it was barely noticeable, but his line of sight was positioned so that he was actually staring at her shoulder. Da Vinci narrowed her eyes slightly towards the night as she started to piece things together. Tarkus? Yes, Miss Da Vinci. You're looking me in the eye, right? She inquired as she tilted her head before waving in the direction of her face. It's just that the helmet makes it hard to tell. Sorry, Miss Da Vinci. Tarkus apologized in a slightly abashed voice. I'm about an inch to the left. As if on cue, Tarkus did indeed turn his head to the left ever so slightly. The end result was him not even staring in her general direction. Is that all right, Miss Da Vinci? The collective eyes of the carriage fell upon Tarkus as they realized he wasn't looking at Da Vinci at all. Your eyes work normally, right? Nero asked rather bluntly as she tilted her head at the saber. Tarkus visibly shifted in surprise at the question. Yes, why? Tarkus. Da Vinci spoke in an amused tone. Are your eyes closed? No. He responded after a moment's silence. Mother said it was very rude not to look someone in the eye when you speak to them. A beat, unless there's someone important. Then mother said to just look at the ground unless they tell you otherwise. Just checking. Da Vinci hummed to herself as she leaned back and raised an eyebrow, a knowing look passing across her face. I've just noticed something. Really? Yes. You haven't actually looked me in the eye once, she stated with a tone of absolute surety. You've been staring in my general direction, but you haven't actually been looking at me. Tarkus remained silent. Your mother didn't teach you to lie, did she? No. Tarkus looked down. Sorry, Miss Da Vinci, it's hard to look you in the face, sorry. Why is that? Tarkus shifted awkwardly in his seat, turning his head to gaze out of the window of the carriage and seemingly unwilling to speak further. He made a noise in the back of his throat that made it clear he was finding it increasingly awkward to be present. What was worse was the fact he could feel the curious stares being aimed in his direction. "I have trouble speaking with pretty girls," he admitted in a quiet tone of voice, looking down at the floor of the carriage. Marie squinted at him. "How long have your eyes been closed?" "Since I got in the carriage." Carrie scratched her cheek as she stared at the screen, her brows furrowed in mild bewilderment before she turned towards the others in the room. Gesturing to Romani to cut out the communication, the doctor nodded his head and cut the connection on the director's end to hide what they were going to say. "Is it weird that we've encountered servants who apparently did the impossible, and between all of them, one is a drunk and the other is just a himbo?" she pointed out with a bemused expression. "Like, is Da Vinci just the exception or something, or is there some hidden aspect we're not seeing?" "You mean aside from the consistent demand for praise?" Romani dryly replied with a raised eyebrow before shaking his head. "Besides, I'm sure that Leo is taking this in her own unique way." He chuckled. "I imagine she's quite a bit surprised at the lack of pioneers being geniuses." "Probably." There was a pause before he realized something. Actually, she might also enjoy being unique. She really can turn any situation to her own advantage, can't she? Maxwell grunted in amusement from his own seated position, and the extended range has managed to detect a slight disturbance coming from up ahead of the group. Romani turned to him with a serious expression. "What sort of disturbance?" "Small scale but quite potent." Maxwell elaborated further as he pressed his hands on the screen and enlarged the image in front of him. "Based on what I'm seeing, it looks to be some sort of defensive bounded field." He frowned as he drummed his fingers on his desk. "But it's more physical than you would normally expect." Carrie looked to her own screen. "Yeah, I can see it as well. Looks more like someone's blessed a wall or something." She paused. "Or created a wall with magical energy around a small settlement. Looks like Ribe too, so someone is trying to defend it." "Defend it from what, is the question though?" Munier asked aloud. "And who is the one doing it? Servants summoned by the Grail or whomever is behind the Singularity to begin with?" "Unfortunately, we won't know until they arrive." Romani sighed, shaking his head and frowning to himself. "Any sign of life forms up ahead?" "The bounded field is muddling the readings a little," Maxwell informed him before he gave a hum of understanding. "I would think that the purpose is to protect it from scrying, so basically to find it you'd need to physically see it." A pause. "That would also mean that they want to keep it hidden, so they're either desperate to hide, or they are doing something they don't want anyone to see." Carrie finished with a grim expression. "So they're either going to walk into a bunch who are going to be happy to see them, or a group that are all death to outsiders." "Unfortunately so." Munier grimaced and rubbed his neck. "We should probably let the director know what she might be walking into, just in case it's a worst-case scenario." "I'll let her know." Romani nodded his head and moved back to the communicator. The Black Knight continued to tap on his leg, content with staring out at the horizon without making a single sound from his mouth. There was, however, something he was deeply curious about. Eventually, it reached a point where he could no longer contain it, and he turned towards the director once again, seemingly debating whether or not to ask her something before he decided to. "Have you done something like this before, Miss Animasphere?" "Animasphere," she corrected him with a curt tone of voice, "and yes." "Okay." He nodded and looked out of the window. "Because it never really got cold at home, so I've never seen snow before." His head shifted from side to side as he stared at it. "Does it always look like this?" "Snow." Marie piped up at his side and hummed to herself. "Yes, but how beautiful it truly looks if affected by location as well as the amount of snow." She pointed over the night and at the horizon. "Such as this, we're in the middle of a snowstorm, but I assume that this landscape is rather lovely during a sunrise." Tarkus nodded his head at her words. "That sounds nice. Did it snow in your home, Miss Marie?" "France. Yes, we did get some cold winters and a touch of snow every now and again." Marie nodded her head with a tranquil smile, a faint twinge of nostalgia in her eyes. "It was actually some of the colder winters that occurred about 10 years before I was born." "Does it snow every year?" Tarkus asked with something akin to childish awe. His innocent tone of voice was more than enough to bring an amused smile to Marie's face as she nodded her head at him. "Wow!" he muttered in sheer amazement as he returned to gazing out of the window. "I can't imagine that. Even when it got really cold, it didn't snow. Mother said that it was only the northern lands that got snow." "What was the weather in your home like?" Nero asked, leaning forwards and resting her chin on her hand. "You make it sound rather pleasant, if you were spared the chills of winter." Well, Tarkus paused as he looked away from the view. It got really hot in the summertime. Actually, some of the plants and trees would catch fire. During the autumn it got a bit chilly but also really wet, so we called it the rainy season. He paused for a moment. Spring was nice though. It got a little warm in spring but not that bad. I like to go to the local river and feed the ducks.
His shoulders puffed themselves up, indicating that he was rather proud of this next achievement. The ducks really liked me. They would always swim up to me when I went near the river and they would speak to me. He paused. They didn't say actual words, but I could tell they were happy to see me.
Tarkus' voice positively dripped with pride as he spoke. The idea that he had made friends with the ducks was apparently something that he was exceedingly happy about. Before anyone else could ask further about his odd fascination with ducks, the communicator flared back into life. The holographic image of Romani's face flashed up with an obvious sense of unease about him. "Director, you're coming up on the settlement of Ribe, but we're having trouble getting some accurate readings of it," he informed her. The woman frowned heavily and turned to face him with a slightly pensive expression. "Why not?" Romani bit his lower lip. "We think it might be a bounded field of some variety to prevent scrying its location, which is why we're having trouble seeing anything inside it. So it's probably the work of a caster servant," he explained to her. "Which means they're either trying to hide out of protection or because they just don't want anyone to see what they're doing." Olga rolled her jaw. "What do we know of this town historically?" "It would have been founded in the late 6th century and early 7th. Romani explained. "Actually, for a portside town it was quite well off. A lot of the currency used in Denmark was thought to have been minted in that location. A lot of the other income came from trading that went on as well, so it shouldn't be too empty."
"So it's a commercial town," Olga remarked with a nod of the head before her eyes narrowed. "Therefore, there is little reason for it to be isolated." She moved her hand towards her mouth and bit into her thumb, "which means that this is going to be our best source of information for what is going on in this singularity." "So far, yeah." Romani nodded his head, "but whether the group present is hostile or friendly, we just don't know yet." He shrugged his shoulders before giving her a half smile. "Maybe they will be friendly. Or maybe they'll try and kill me." She bluntly shot back before rolling her jaw. It would be simple enough to just avoid the town and go elsewhere, but as it stood, the next location probably wouldn't be for a few dozen miles, and the idea of patrolling the entire Danish countryside, especially in this weather, without any actual source of information wasn't one that she was willing to make. On the other hand, if they went to Ribe and found out that it was the central territory for whoever was running this singularity, then there was a chance they would end up being defeated and killed. "I think we should say hello to them." Tarkus chimed in from his side of the carriage. "What's the worst that could happen?" "Death, you idiot," Olga bluntly retorted without so much as turning in his direction, still internally debating whether they should keep on going or try and investigate the town. She removed her thumb from her mouth and ground her teeth together, eyes flickering around the carriage wheel. She trailed off and fell into another thoughtful silence. Nero and Marie exchanged a glance with each other before they both turned back to the hesitant master. The woman continued to think in silence without making a single utterance. "I believe we should investigate," Nero proclaimed loudly, pressing a hand against her chest and puffing herself out. "With the forces we have available, even if they do prove hostile, we should at least be able to make a rapid escape in the worst case." She turned to Tarkus and beamed, "Not to mention our newest addition who can make the impossible possible." Tarkus fidgeted under the praise, looking away from the Emperor and towards his feet. "Well, I think you're being a bit too generous there, but if you say so." He looked back up, turning to the director. "Don't worry, Miss Olga. I'll make sure nothing bad happens to you. I'm still a knight after all."
"Wonderful." Marie clapped her hands together and turned to the director with a reassuring smile. "See? We are prepared for the worst."
Olga looked at her and then swept her gaze across the carriage. An odd look passed through her eyes before they turned resigned and flickered away from them and towards the window. "Fine," she responded to them after a few moments. "Take us to spotting distance before we approach." It showed how much faith they had in her as a master. They were already prepared to have to fight a retreat rather than debate the possibility of victory. Servants were just supposed to be mere familiars on paper, and yet they were already telling her that they fully expected every encounter of battle they had with her as their leader to end in disaster. She shifted in her seat to further hide her expression from the servants, doing her best to contain her rather tumultuous emotions. She didn't want to consider any of them seeing her in this state, and the idea that they would was nothing short of traumatic. Avoiding the gazes of the servants, she hunkered down and fell into a deep silence as she already imagined the ways that their first encounter was going to go horribly wrong and she would inevitably be blamed for it when it wasn't even her fault to begin with. Closing her eyes, she steadied her breathing.
It worked out in Rome when Stahl obeyed her commands.
Therefore, as long as the servants obeyed her commands, then everything would work out fine.
The carriage ground to a halt, sitting still in the snow at least a kilometer from the town of Ribe. The main issue wasn't the presence of woodland blocking their path, rather the complete lack of a woodland. Instead, there was only patchy black dirt covered with a thin layer of snow that hadn't completely settled. That much indicated that either it had occurred recently or that the snowstorm wasn't an ongoing occurrence and had only formed recently. The group slowly climbed down from the carriage and into the open, Tarkus stepping towards the black ground and dropping down to one knee. The knight reached out and stuck his hand into the floor and grasped at the dirt before raising his hand up and shifting through it with his thumb. "It's burnt," he informed the group as he let the ash slip in between his fingers, standing back up and turning around to face the group before offering a single shrug. "It's all burnt."
Clearly, Olga huffed as she pulled her hood over her head and affixed her goggles over her eyes, walking towards the ground and staring down at it. A frown came upon her face behind her thermal mask as she scanned the location. The patchy burnt patches of ground were occasionally displaced with a stump rising up from the ground, for perhaps a few feet before it curtailed off into a shard. As she looked closer, she could see further points of uneven ground that revealed themselves to be toppled over logs and the like. As she squinted at them, she took notice that they were similarly burned. "This is most disturbing," Nero commented from behind her, placing her hands on her hips and frowning heavily. "This has the hallmarks of an attack meant to stop anything from being rebuilt." Her eyes scanned their surroundings and the frown only deepened. This level of destruction would require an army to do so, or perhaps a servant with a preference for flames. Unless, Marie cupped her chin, a gentle and thoughtful hum emerging from her throat as her eyes narrowed. "I recall the Singularity in France having similar scenes of destruction. Those were caused by an influx of wyverns accompanied by a dragon." Olga rolled her jaw, crossing her arms and drumming her fingers on her upper arm. That is, she cast another glance over the devastation before she raised up her communicator. "Romani, what are the local readings for the area?" "Not looking good," Romani informed her with a pensive frown. "From the looks of it, there isn't a single woodland within a mile of you on any side. It's like the entire landscape has been burnt to nothing." He nodded towards the direction of the rider. "I would say that Queen Marie is on the right track. This is the sort of damage that is consistent with high concentrations of wyverns and dragons. Although whether this has anything to do with the actual singularity or is merely a byproduct." "You refer to the case in the third singularity where Fujimaru encountered wyverns in the wild summoned by the distortion," she realized with a frown. Neither case was particularly appealing to her, but it would make sense why a magus would want to conceal their position from scrying. If there was someone directing the wyverns rather than them being wild, then it would be best to prevent any sort of long-distance spell from discerning their location. It meant they would need to scour the entire country in order to find them, which would mean a long and bloody war. Whatever else, they confirmed that there was definitely something occurring within Denmark that might relate to dragonkind. At the very least, she could expect them. Of course, she could have told Romani that. That little comment where he told her that the writer had the idea was nothing more than a jab at her competency. She could just tell that was the case. The director held her tongue, biting back whatever scathing remark she had for the doctor in favor of focusing on the task at hand. She turned her attention to the west and stared across the horizon. As expected, even with a majority of the landscape flattened, she still couldn't see the town of Ribe in the distance, which meant they would have to get closer. But with conditions like this, they would probably end up seeing each other at the same time. It wasn't like the carriage was well hidden amidst the snow backdrop, and any magus or caster servant who went through the trouble of keeping an entire town hidden from anything but the most advanced scrying wasn't liable to be caught off guard by a carriage just riding through this place. They would have set up a warning system of some kind to alert them. They would set up a warning system and they'd just blunder right the way through it and end up waltzing into a trap. She continued to stare at the horizon, giving an internal growl before she looked away in an irritable huff. They didn't have much of a choice unless they wanted to go back to blindly riding across the entire country. There was every possibility that any other center of civilization in the local area had been reduced to a similar state. They just couldn't guarantee anything when it came to their current situation, and she truthfully hated that. Again, They didn't have much in the way of a choice.
Grinding her teeth once again, she waved her hand back in the direction of the carriage. "We're going," she informed the group as she turned on her heel and marched back towards their vehicle. "Get back in carriage." The next words were virtually forced out of her mouth. "We're going to ride." Tarkus tilted his head at her. "We are?" He blinked behind his helmet. "I thought you didn't want to go, Miss Olga." "Of course I don't want to go there," she snapped at him, whirling around and glaring at the saber behind her goggles. "But it's not like there is much of a choice, is there?" Tarkus flinched and looked down. "Now do as you're told and get in the carriage." With that said, she flung the door to the carriage open and stepped back into the vehicle and out of the cold. Tarkus stood there for a few moments more in the quiet before he looked down at his feet, shuffling his legs in the ashen snow. Eventually, he looked back up and took notice of Marie and Nero giving him mildly concerned looks. He waved his hand at the pair of them.
"It's fine," he assured them. "I'm sure Miss Olga is just a bit stressed right now." He spoke in a gentle tone of voice. "She'll probably feel better soon enough. Dragons are pretty scary." He chuckled as he started to walk forwards. "When we aren't in trouble, she'll calm down." The confidence at which he spoke managed to abate the worries, if only slightly, for the two other servants as they followed suit after the saber and stepped back into the wagon. With the group once again in the carriage, the transport continued on its ride west of the group in the direction of Ribe. The group was entirely unaware, as they departed, of the pair of white wolves that gazed upon them in the distance. Their fur perfectly allowing them to blend into their surroundings even without their magical nature to assist them in remaining hidden. The pair of wolves soon turned to glance at one another before their eyes fell back on the retreating shape of the carriage, their eyes already funneling information back towards their owner. "Jarl!" a voice called out, accompanied by the sound of rushing footsteps as they closed in on the figure hunched over near the wall. Wall in the loosest possible term, it was a patchwork of branches grown from the ground that interlocked with each other, rising up at least 10 feet high and arching inwards in a slight curve. Along the inner surface of the wall were a consistent line of symbols carved into the wood, each marking glowed ever so slightly and spread across the entire length. The figure shifted in their crouched position, and looked over their shoulder. The nail-shaped helmet with antlers jutting from either side looked in the direction of the speaker. A young man with blonde hair and a rough-cut beard stretching across his chin, garbed in simple chainmail and a tunic underneath. They slowly rose to their feet and turned in the man's direction fully, towering over the individual and staring down at them. Ragged fur cloak billowing in the wind as they did so before they raised their left hand up to halt the rushing man. "Peace, young warrior." His voice was deep and mature. "Breathe, you cannot deliver a message if you yourself are too tired to speak." The young man nodded his head, slowing his breathing as best he could and nodding his head before he looked back up. "Jarl Torin, the Volva has a message. He says that others approach the wall." Torin paused at the words. "People." He is certain of his words, Brynjar. The young man nodded his head vigorously. "He assures all with absolute certainty. He says they will be here before the passing of the storm." Torin visibly shifted with the words, turning away from the young man and staring towards the wall itself. Although his expression hidden behind his large helmet, it did nothing to conceal his thoughtful hum, nor the way his posture shifted to appear more contemplative. He raised a single hand in the direction of Brynjar. "Find Torni and tell him to prepare the warriors but to hold fast. We need not make enemies with the spawn of the black serpent swarming in our skies." Brynjar nodded his head. "I shall go to the front gate and prepare myself to meet with them." He saw the look of alarm on the young man's face before he spoke again. "Inform the Volva to accompany me when he has the time, but to maintain a watch on them." He started to walk away from the wall and towards the other end of the settlement. And what more have the survivors from the north had to say? Brynjar hesitated for a moment before he spoke. "They have still not awoken. I am growing concerned, to die here and not in battle." His expression turned grim. "They do not deserve to walk the halls of hell." "And they will not." Torin interrupted him, turning to face him. "If dealing with the arrivals proves peaceful, then perhaps we might enlist their aid." Brynjar blinked. "You believe so? There is little else for us. We can barely withstand the attacks as it stands, and given that we are now present," his tone turned grim, "I have little doubt that the Black Serpent of Dread will be upon us." The man blanched. "Fafnir." Torin nodded his head in acknowledgement as the pair continued their walk, moving past the groups of other individuals as they made themselves busy with other duties about the town, stopping to nod in the direction of the pair. Brynjar paused before he spoke again. Do you perhaps believe they might also be emissaries of Lord Odin?
Torin paused at that, humming to himself in thought. Perhaps, but they might be travelers, he continued on before shaking his head and dismissing the thought. It matters little to speculate right now. We shall see when they arrive. He turned to face Brynjar and pat him on the shoulder. I have issued my command, now go and see it done.
Brynjar nodded his head. As you say, Jarl. With that said, he turned away from the taller man and rushed back through the town, heading in the direction of the wooden hall at the far end, moving past the bundles of armored men and women.
Torin watched the young man depart before he focused his attention on the pseudo-gate and crossed his arms, closing his eyes behind his helmet. There was much to consider, especially with the recent attack by serpents they had repelled. They'd failed to kill all of the beasts, and that meant they would inevitably return to their master. When that occurred, it didn't matter what manner of runes they had carved into the wood, it wouldn't protect them from the wrath of the one who brought calamity.
They would need to move from this location, however to his knowledge there were few places of sanctuary. It would all depend upon what those who had fled from the Northland would say. To say nothing of recent arrivals in such a location, although it conceded with what his fellow druid had spoken of. Those who watched stars would arrive in the land scorched by fire. He might not have been a seer, but he wasn't going to doubt the words of one. It mattered little either way, battling the Black Serpent was not something he could possibly do alone, and the assistance of his fellow druid mattered remarkably little. Their foe was just too powerful. Exhaling gently, he released a half chuckle and reached up to rub the bridge of his helmet. No time for such sour thoughts. He muttered to himself as he walked towards the gate and willed the branches to retract, exposing the outside world and allowing himself to step outside before they slowly worked themselves closed behind him. And Olga problems and already an idea as to what is going on around here. And yes, Torin is another OC Dark Souls servant like with Verndari. 5 guesses who they are. But anyway, we're away. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.